The ancient mysteries of the world are some of the most intriguing rabbit holes that you will ever go down. On this iceberg, we've got surface level stuff like Atlantis and the Easter Island heads, but we also get really deep in the trenches with stuff like the possibility that God had a wife and a Roman legion may have once started a town in China. There's plenty of stuff in between that you definitely haven't heard about, so join me right now in this compilation of the entire ancient mysteries of the world iceberg. Shout out to user oldthrace who compiled all these mysteries into this iceberg, and now let's get into the first one, which is the lost city of Atlantis. As you probably know, Atlantis is the lost city that's said to have sunk to the bottom of the ocean. Was it real? There's no way to know for sure. That's why it's a mystery. Do we know anything about it? We know some from Plato's works, Timaeus and Critias, but were those even real or were they fiction? We don't know. Plato said that Atlantis was an island, obviously in the ocean, past the Pillars of Hercules, which is now known as the Strait of Gibraltar. He gives the length and width of the island, but I calculated it to be about 79,000 square miles, which is about the size of Idaho. Now, Atlantis was supposedly founded by Atlas, who was the half-god, half-man son of Poseidon, the god of the sea. As a result, this place was said to be full of gold and riches. Kind of like that episode of SpongeBob that showed the lost city of Atlantis, where there's just futuristic stuff, gold and everything like that. Now, they apparently came by these riches by conquering and pillaging other islands in the Mediterranean, and that eventually led to their downfall. Apparently, they tried to attack ancient Athens, and obviously that's a bad idea. That's like the gods' hotspot, so they made all the Greek gods mad at them at the same time, and they were eventually sunk into the ocean for this. Now, realistically, Atlantis was lost due to fire and earthquakes, which makes sense. It lines up with the effects of a volcanic eruption. So what inspired Plato to write all this about Atlantis? Well, it was a real volcanic eruption. An absolutely massive volcanic eruption on the Greek island of Thera was recorded in ancient Egyptian records in the year 1500 BC, so this could have actually happened as Plato said it did. Now, plenty of other groups had ideas about what happened to Atlantis as well, but most notably, the Nazis were very interested in the lore. Now, for some reason, the Nazis believed that their Aryan race was the supreme form of the human being, and they thought that this Aryan race stemmed from the supermen of Atlantis that escaped whenever it sunk to the bottom of the ocean. Remember, they were supposedly half god, half man, so they have some god blood in there. Now, discovering this stuff was kind of one of the most important things to the Nazis, and it eventually led to their downfall because they devoted so many resources to it. And you know that this belief of the Aryan race being the supreme being also led to the Holocaust, so Plato, thanks for that. It's not Plato's fault. I'm just messing, but still. It all stems from the Atlantean legends. Next up in the iceberg, we have the late Bronze Age collapse. Alright, so obviously you've probably heard of the Bronze Age, but if you don't know what it was a time period. It was 3300 to 1200 BC. Like the name implies, this was the age that bronze was invented. Bronze offered a sturdier alternative in tools than copper did, because they previously had copper, but bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, so it strengthens it with the tin. Now, different parts of the globe experienced the Bronze Age at different times because they discovered bronze at different times, but what was this late age collapse all about? Now, the Bronze Age was actually very prosperous in most areas, especially in the Mediterranean, which is the main place we're going to talk about today. So the sudden collapse of society is pretty surprising. Basically, what happened is that major cities like Troy and Hattusa fell, trade and political relationships fell, writing systems like the Mycenaean Linear B were completely lost to history, and countless wars and internal struggles led to a complete collapse of society. I say Linear B, but we're going to talk about Linear A later. Linear B kind of was discovered, so it's being used to decipher Linear A, which really was lost to history. Scholars say that the most likely culprit for the complete collapse of society during this Bronze Age was a perfect storm of earthquakes and climate change that weakened infrastructure and agriculture. At the same time, strange sea peoples arrived from off the coast of the Mediterranean to try to conquer some of these places like city-states and places like that. So they were trying to conquer lands that were already having political turmoil because of, you know, the collapse of infrastructure, because of climate change and agricultural failures and everything like that. Like I said, all this leads back to climate, but trade was also disrupted. If agriculture was suffering, then they had nothing to trade for bronze, right? Well, some of these societies probably had bronze, but it was very scarce in the Mediterranean area, so they had to trade for it. Specifically, tin was rare in this area, not just bronze, because obviously bronze is man-made, but tin was rare. They didn't have tin mines everywhere around, so they had to trade with other societies. If they didn't have anything to trade for this tin, they couldn't make enough bronze to sustain their tools and weapons and everything like that. So like I said, some people call the late Bronze Age collapse a perfect storm of calamities and natural occurring disasters and everything like that. And I can't really argue with that unless... Just real quick, thank you for watching this monstrous video. You have no idea how much it means to me. If you would, hit that subscribe button because it helps me out a lot. And now, let's get back into it. Next up, the Oracle of Delphi was a Greek oracle said to deliver the prophecies of Apollo. Apollo was the Greek god of many things, but he held so much sway with prophecy because he was the god of truth and prophecy. Known as the Pythia, the oracle was a woman that resided at Apollo's temple in Delphi. Now, this took place from the 8th century BC through the 4th, so obviously there were several different women as the Pythia. Now, people came to seek her advice and prophecies all the time. It was said that great historical figures like Socrates and Alexander the Great actually came to visit her, so obviously her prophecies were held in high regard at the time. It's interesting to know that the original Pythia was a young and pure girl, but it was said that a man from Thessaly showed up and had his way with her, so they kind of had to change things up from there on. Because of this, the future Pythia were older women who would still dress young so that they would appear young, but they wouldn't have these same problems that the young girl did. Now, the oracle got into some weird stuff, I'll tell you that much. Once a month, the Pythia would go through purity rituals. Now, these include fasting, bathing naked in the Castalian spring, and drinking holy water, all after a priest reads a long passage that tells her what to do in that order. There's also an entire ritual that took place in the temple revolving around the sacrifice of a young goat kid, so that's interesting. Alright, so obviously, unless you believe in the entire pantheon of Greek gods, then you know that the oracle's prophecies were not based in, actual prophetic notions. So why did she have these ideas and what made her so special? One theory about where she gets all her prophecies and weird notions and everything like that was that there was a spring that ran under the temple at Delphi, and that spring gave off a hallucinogenic gas such as methane or ethylene, and it caused her to be delirious. Another theory is that there was a poisonous plant known as oleander that they chewed and smoked in the temple, and that led to her weird goings on. Now, either one of these theories could be correct because it was said that the oracle only practiced in the warmest 9 months of the year, which kind of lines up with either oleander being in season and having a big stock of it, or these hotter gases being given off by the spring. Oh yeah, I didn't even mention that the oracle only gave her prophecies on the 7th day of the month because after she gave her prophecy, she was so tired and wore out that she couldn't even function. It was said that it even shortened the lifespan of the woman giving the prophecies. I think that kind of lines up with the whole toxic fumes thing, but think what you will. Next up, we have Stonehenge. Stonehenge is a man-made structure made of massive rocks that was said to be done in phases from 3100 BC to about 1500 BC. Now, it's a super cool structure, but nobody knows exactly what it was for. Most people theorize that it was built as a burial grounds because in excavations over the years, they've found like thousands and thousands of bone fragments. Now, the stones are set to perfectly align with different solstices and sun patterns, so like many other ancient civilizations, these people that made this greatly valued the sun. Anyway, while it was probably just a burial ground, there were several legends built around the topic. It's been a day and I'm in a different shirt, but we're back. First off, a folktale said that the devil was on the earth, and for some reason he decided to pick the stones up and put them on the Salisbury Plain just so nobody would ever know how they got there. Another tale says that the great wizard Merlin and some giants moved the stones to the plain, and they were actually healing stones. It's a whole long story. Next up on the iceberg, we have the Spear of Longinus, or the Holy Spear that pierced Jesus' side on the cross. Now, this spear was never actually found in its entirety, but several fragments were found that were said to be part of it, and they were used to guarantee victory in battle. Some went so far as to say that whoever held the fragments of the spear in their hands held the destiny of the world in their hands. So there's a story about this guy named Peter Bartholomew who thought he had had a dream that told him where the spear's fragments were. He said that it was Saint Andrew who came to him in a dream and for some reason showed him where the fragments of the Holy Spear were. Well, the crusading army that he was kind of a part of dug down in the spot where he said it was going to be, and they found absolutely nothing. But he wasn't going to give up. He jumped down in the hole himself, and he grabbed a fragment of stone and pulled it out of the dirt and said that that's the fragment of the Holy Spear. Well, it was a piece of iron. It wasn't stone. Now, my personal theory about this was that since nobody actually found anything, he was probably having like a drunk dream because people said he was a womanizer and an alcoholic. But anyway, he came prepared. He jumped in the hole himself and had a piece of metal just in his pocket. He pulled it out, and that's what he said was a piece of the Holy Spear. He obviously wanted some clout or something. Anyway, the fact that they'd found part of the Holy Spear boosted the morale of the Crusaders, and they actually went to win that next battle that they fought in. But it wasn't so good for Peter Bartholomew. Other people started doubting the fact that he just pulled a piece of the Holy Spear out of his pants or out of the ground or whatever, and they doubted the sanctity of the item, so he demanded a trial by fire. Now, the fact that he actually demanded this trial, it wasn't put upon him by somebody else, makes me think that maybe he actually did believe he had a piece of the Holy Spear. But at the same time, whenever he had this trial by fire, fire, he was burned to death. Kind of makes you wonder what was going on in his head there. Next up on the iceberg is our question, what was the Star of Bethlehem? Now, if you aren't up on your biblical knowledge, that's okay. Basically, what the Star of Bethlehem was a star that the wise men that came to visit Jesus followed. They followed it from countries over all the way to Jerusalem and into Bethlehem. This is all in Matthew chapter 2. Let me just read you a short excerpt here. This is going to be from Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, and then 9 and 10. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who was born king of the Jews? For we have seen a star in the east and have come to worship him. We're going to skip down to 9 here. When they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. So as the story says, these wise men came from the east, which was likely Persia, Arabia, or somewhere over there. They followed this star all the way to Jerusalem, where they talked to King Herod, and then after talking to King Herod, they followed it all the way to Bethlehem. Obviously, Bethlehem is where Jesus was born. Now, the question that the iceberg poses is, what exactly was this star? Because that's not a naturally occurring phenomenon that we know about. Now, I will tell you this right now, I am a Christian, so I believe that there was some divine intervention there, but at the same time, the scientific explanation could tell us what God did within our universe to create that Star of Bethlehem. Now, speculations say that this might have been a nova, which is an exploding star, and it just so happened to be positioned in the sky right above Jerusalem and Bethlehem. It also could have been a planetary conjunction, which is when two or more planets are really close together and they shine really bright, and it could have been oriented right over Bethlehem. This is one of those mysteries that we'll really just never know unless we somehow figure out time travel and take some astronomers back in time to figure it out. But anyway, that's that. Next up, we have Zoroaster and the religion he founded, Zoroastrianism. Zoroaster's given name was Zarathustra. That's how you say it, I think, maybe Zarathustra. But anyway, he was a priest of the ancient Iranian religion, and he received a dream and a vision and decided to shake things up within this religion. So the ancient Iranian religion that we're talking about worshipped different gods, several different gods. But Zoroaster claimed that he received a vision from the god of wisdom, Ahura Mazda, that told him to quit all that and just worship Ahura Mazda. So basically, he took the polytheism of the ancient Iranian religion and made it monotheistic. Now, Zoroaster promptly began spreading this word, this holy message that he received all throughout Persia, and eventually the holy text of the religion, Avesta, was created and written. The core tenets of this religion include monotheism under Ahura Mazda, the fact that all the evil in the world stem from Angra Mainyu, the fact that everyone in the world has the freedom to choose between good and evil, which I agree with that, and the fact that goodness is shown through good thoughts, words, and deeds. Now, I don't know about you, but these core tenets, aside from all the different rituals and everything that goes on like that, it kind of sounds a lot like Christianity to me. Really, any Abrahamic religion. It's one God opposed by one devil, good and evil being a choice, and the fact that one that lives a good life can live after death in a paradise. Now, I will say the afterlife gets a little funky compared to Christianity. The bridge of Chinvat, which is kind of like the gates of heaven, is guarded by dogs that kind of decide where you're gonna go. Not really, but anyway, they guard this bridge. After that, you go on a whole journey guided by actually who decides where you're gonna go, and you're gonna go to either like a heaven, a paradise, or a hell, or a purgatory, something like that. Now, back to reality. Over time, governments and empires would fall, and this would lead to the fall of the religion because the Muslim Arabs took over the area and all but wiped it out. Several Zoroastrian survivors would flee from Persia, and they would eventually land in India, where they live now as Parsis. That's what they call them. Now, Zoroaster was said to have lived in the 6th century BC, so all this took place a long time ago. This dude apparently influenced modern Islamic beliefs as well as Judaism and Christianity, all the Abrahamic religions that are monotheistic, so the fact that I've never heard of him until I started researching this video is kind of mind-blowing to me. I'm really enjoying this iceberg thing. Next up, we have the question, where is the exact location of Jesus' tomb? Well, traditionally, everyone believes that the tomb is located in Jerusalem, inside the Edicule Shrine, which is inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There's another place called the Garden Tomb where it could be located, but the dates don't really line up with this one. When examining the Gospel of Matthew, we see that Joseph of Arimathea got Jesus' dead body and placed it in a tomb. This tomb was brand new at the time. This fact right here is what contrasts the Garden Tomb theory, because the Garden Tomb was dated to like 700 years before the death of Christ. Now, here's what we have against the Edicule Shrine theory. Like I said, it was built within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was built by Helena. Helena was a Roman empress who was the mother of Constantine the Great, but what she wasn't great at was biblical accuracy. She was known for building churches and religious monuments based on her own spiritual whims, so the validity of this place being the actual tomb of Christ is iffy at best. In short, it's likely that this place and the Garden Tomb, neither one were actually the tomb of Christ. At least that's my opinion. I don't know if we'll ever know where it really was. The ancient Minoan writing system of Linear A is next up on the iceberg. Remember when we talked about the late Bronze Age collapse collapse earlier? Well, like I said, this was one of the writing systems that was lost to history forever. Hopefully not forever, but anyway. Linear A was what is known as a logosyllabic writing system, which basically means that it has characters for numerals and syllables and even other things. Needless to say, it still hasn't been deciphered. Now, Linear A inspired the creation of Linear B, which turned out to be the root of the ancient Greek writing system, so it was deciphered, but Linear A just hasn't been yet. Maybe there's a Rosetta Stone type thing out there that'll eventually let us read it. I don't know. It's one of those things that the late Bronze Age collapse took from us, and I don't know if we'll ever really decipher it. Speaking of the late Bronze Age, let's talk about the sea peoples that we mentioned earlier were part of the collapse of society. These were the people that were said to appear off the coast in Mediterranean cities and just wreak havoc. Egyptian records, which actually make up most of the records on these people, said that these sea people just showed up and conquered everything. The Egyptians thought them to be tribes known as the Shurden, Luca, Tertia, and Akawasha, but others say they were Trojan, Italian, or even Philistine. Now, after conquering many Mediterranean cities, they were said to have attacked Egypt, and the Egyptians said that they fought them back. Again, we still have no concrete answer as to who exactly they were, but it's likely that one of those accounts we gave on behalf of the Egyptians was true. It was probably one of these tribes. I don't know. These people are probably like everybody else at the time. They suffered because of the climate change. They suffered because they didn't have enough tin to make their bronze, and they had political infighting. But instead of sitting there and letting their society die, they went and attacked Mediterranean cities and decided to do something about it. They actually gained their own land. You can't really hate on them. They kind of helped the collapse of the society in the late Bronze Age, but you got to do what you got to do. I understand it. So let's talk about our first mystery, the Nazca lines in the desert of southern Peru. These are giant geoglyphs, which are basically just giant lines carved into the earth, and they represent animals or plants. Now, these things are so large that it's said that they would cover over 800 miles if they were all straightened out in a line. Several different theories talk about what they think they might have been used for, the first of which being that they were astronomical in nature. They represented constellations or pointed to them, or they were important during solstices, something like that. Other people think they could have been religious. They could have been used as like blessings, getting blessings from the gods for the land and the people and things like that. Now, obviously, either one of these theories could be true, or they could have been used for irrigation methods or something like that, but there's also another theory that really stands out to me, and that's aliens. One guy that's just a little bit crazy said that ancient aliens probably landed in the Nazca Desert and their UFO left these lines in the dirt. This guy says that these aliens landed their UFO in the desert, then they left and started many ancient civilizations like, you know, Egyptians. But anyway, after they did all that, they just got back on their UFO and left. I'll be the first one to admit it to y'all. It probably didn't happen, but it could have. Next up, let's talk about the Trojan War. Simply put, the Trojan War was a war between the Greeks and the Trojans in the 11th or 12th century BC. Like a lot of other historic events that happened during this time period in history, we don't really know if this actually happened. Kind of like Atlantis that we talked about in the first video. We don't know if Troy was even a real city. Actually, that's not true. For a long time, we didn't think Troy was a real city, but now they're kind of uncovering archaeological evidence that it was real. It's not just a figure of Homer's imagination. Anyway, the Trojan War is a really fun thing to talk about. So the whole war started because the Greek goddesses Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena wanted to be known as the prettiest goddess of all the land. And for some reason they asked this guy Paris, who was a prince of Troy, who was the prettiest. This guy answered that Aphrodite was the most beautiful in all the land, and as a reward, Aphrodite gave him Helen of Sparta, who was known as the most beautiful human woman in all the land, to love him. This was a problem because she was not just an ordinary Spartan woman. She was the wife of the king of Sparta, King Menelaus. She was the queen of the land. So obviously when she ran away to be with him, the Greeks didn't take too kindly to this. They mobilized their army and held a siege over Troy for 10 years. Right at the end of the war, the Greeks had the genius idea that was the Trojan horse. They acted like they were giving up, and they gave Troy a giant wooden horse as a gift. The Greeks made a show of sailing away and ending the war, but that wouldn't last. See, this Trojan horse was full of Greek soldiers, and as it was the symbol of the end of the war, the Trojans obviously started celebrating. That night, as all the Trojans were celebrating, these Greeks snuck out of the Trojan horse, and they unlocked the city gates. In the background, these Greeks that sailed away earlier sailed back in the darkness, and as the city gates were now unlocked, they stormed the city of Troy and destroyed it from the inside. The Trojan War gave us the great heroes of Achilles and Odysseus, Hector and Paris, Menelaus, and many more. But even if this isn't how it actually went down historically, because obviously the Greek gods probably weren't real, it's still huge in historical significance. The Trojan horse is a staple of the English vernacular these days. We even have like a computer malware known as the Trojan horse. So overall, the Trojan War probably did happen, but it probably didn't happen exactly as we know it. Unless you believe in the entire pantheon of Greek gods and the validity of Homer's epics, which in that case, more power to you. Next up on the iceberg is the question, when was Jesus born? Alright, so you're probably screaming at me Christmas, December 25th, and I'll give it to you. That's what we've been told our entire lives. Let's talk about it though. Jesus was born in Bethlehem around the year 0, you know, the switch between BC to AD or BCE to CE if you're a newfangled scientist, but anyway, he was probably actually born 4 to 6 years before the year 0, so the time switch doesn't perfectly line up, but anyway, was he actually born on December 25th? Probably not. In Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, Caesar Augustus makes a huge decree to the public that everyone in his empire needs to report to their nearest city for a massive population census. Now, this right here would cause super long trips for his citizens because it's very hard to travel on camel and donkey to the nearest city. It's going to take a long time. Historians say that he probably would not have done this in the wintertime, and I tend to agree with that. Also in Luke chapter 2, verse 8, Luke talks about sheep outside grazing at night, which is something that would not happen in the wintertime. If you know anything about farming, sheep come in at night during the winter. Okay, so we've established he probably wasn't born in December, but when was he born? Let's just get a little bit big brain here. We can approximate it using the birth of John the Baptist. John the Baptist was conceived in the month of June if we believe the Hebrew texts. 6 months into his mother Elizabeth's pregnancy, the angel Gabriel announced the conception of Jesus within his mother Mary. So 6 months from John's conception in June is December, and 9 months after December is roughly September, so Jesus was probably born in roughly September. Now, Christmas is traditionally celebrated on December 25th because the Emperor Constantine believed in a historian's dating of the Bible, which could technically be right, but probably not. Here's why I think that. December 25th happened to be the exact day of 3 different pagan gods' giant celebrations, so it's likely that the heavily Christian Emperor Constantine just wanted to overshadow everything they were doing with his Christianity. I don't know. That's just kind of what I think, and that's what other people have said as well in my research, so that's kind of what I'm thinking there. But Jesus could have been born on the 25th of December. Whatever you want to believe. Where is the tomb of Alexander the Great, and how did he die? Alright, so this massive figurehead from history influenced basically everything we do today. Like 99.9% of culture around is because of Hellenistic culture inspired by Alexander the Great. And he did this in only 32 years of life. I actually didn't know that. That's crazy. This behemoth of a man died from a fever. It was probably not a normal fever. It was like typhoid fever, which was one of the worst bacterial diseases ever. But still, man, a fever? That's not fair. Whenever you see a great historical figure die from something small or something that could easily be cured today, or just general mistakes like the bloodletting that killed George Washington, it's just crazy, man. Now, there are other theories as to what could have happened to Alexander the Great, from like poisoning to other diseases to he could have been buried alive. Historians think he could have had Guillain-Barré syndrome, which paralyzes you from the neck down, and he could have actually been alive whenever he was buried. This speculation is backed up by the fact that his body didn't decompose for 6 days after his death. Anyway, now that I'm done chasing that rabbit, Alexander died in Babylon at the palace of King Nebuchadnezzar in the year 323 BC. After his death, his body was kind of played with, not like that, for some time. There was a massive power struggle to try to fill this gap that Alexander's death left, so obviously his body was involved. I mean, that just goes with the territory, right? His body was first buried in Memphis, not Tennessee, in Egypt, and then it was later moved to the Egyptian Alexandria. Historical figures like Julius Caesar, Augustus, Cleopatra, Caligula, and many more have been said to have visited this tomb, but here's the fun part. We can't find it. There have been over 140 sanctioned searches for this tomb since the 19th century, which is only like 200 years ago, and none of them have yielded any results worth anything. As recent as this year, 2024, there was a book published that says his tomb could be in the eastern Egyptian desert, but we really don't know. Next up on the iceberg, we have the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. These gardens were one of the 7 wonders of the world, but just like our last entry, we don't know where they were. Obviously, due to the name, we can assume that they were in Babylon, but here's the thing, we don't know. There's no evidence to prove they were ever there. These gardens have 3 different origin stories that could be possible. First, King Nebuchadnezzar could have had these built for his wife, who was previously a Mede, and she enjoyed greenery, so he had the gardens built. Second, they could have been constructed by the legendary Queen Semiramis, or third, they might not even be Babylonian. They might have actually been the work of King Sennacherib in Nineveh. No matter who built them, it's clear that these things were constructed for pleasure because they included plants like horticultural plants and flowers rather than crops and food production plants. These gardens were said to be beautiful, even deserving a spot among the 7 wonders of the world. The Moai are next up on our iceberg, but you probably know them as the Easter Island Heads, or my profile picture. Easter Island, which is off the coast of South America and affiliated with Chile, is the home of over 900 of these moai heads. These giant stone figures are constructed from solidified volcanic ash in a 3-to-1 trunk to head ratio. They have huge eyebrows and noses, as well as a chiseled jawline, and they also have these tiny little hands and arms close to their torsos. So calling them the Easter Island heads is not completely accurate because they kind of look like this. Most of these things are buried up to their shoulders, which is why we're calling them the Easter Island heads in pop culture these days. The average size for one of these things is 13 foot tall and weighs 14 tons. The biggest moai they ever found was 33 feet tall and about 90 tons, which is just massive. Think about this for a second. These things were constructed between the years of like 1250 and 1500 AD by the native Rapa Nui people, so they absolutely had no heavy machinery to help them transport them. But they sure enough transported them. These things were built in a massive volcanic crater which is close to the eastern side of Easter Island, but these moai have been found all over the perimeter of the island, so they've definitely transported them everywhere. I don't know about you, but moving these 14-ton stone figures is pretty dang impressive. Honestly, I'm not quite sure how they would achieve this moving of these things, but some people have theorized that they would set them on logs and then just kind of roll them along to their destination, but even this would take like 50 to 100 people, so it's still crazy. Ancient engineering was so crazy. You had to make do with what you had, and so many of these civilizations have done such incredible things like this. It's just crazy. This right here is why I make these videos after all, to just have been a fly on the wall, or not even on the wall because they didn't really have that many walls. But back then, flying around, seeing what these ancient people did and how they did it, it would have been amazing to me. Anyway, these moai had actual meaning to these people, as you can assume. They were symbols of ancient spirits and their ancestors, and they were set to face out toward the village to provide oversight and guidance for the people. These things are some of the coolest statues in ancient history, so I'm very, very glad I got to cover them on this part of the iceberg. Next up, we have Sodom and Gomorrah. This right here is a classic biblical tale from the Old Testament. These two ancient cities were said to be a cesspit of wickedness and evil and sin, and God didn't like that, so he tasked Abraham with finding just 50 righteous people in both towns, and if he could, he would spare the town. Well, Abraham knew how bad it was, and he knew he would never find 50 people, so he talked God down to just 10 people. Spoiler alert, he did not find 10 people. Abraham's nephew Lot managed to escape the city with 2 of his daughters and his wife for a second, but his wife looked back at the burning city of Sodom and was turned to a pillar of salt, so that's just highly unfortunate. Oh yeah, and Lot eventually had relations with both of these daughters he escaped with, which spawned the Moabites and the Ammonites of the Bible, so that's interesting. Anyway, Sodom and Gomorrah were said to have been destroyed by hellfire and brimstone, but in an earthly sense, what did God use and manipulate on this earth to make that happen? History says that the Dead Sea might have been destroyed by a massive earthquake, and it sent flaming tar to cover both of these cities, just burning them up. Obviously, this is horrifying, and if you were in this city, you would know you were gonna die, but seeing flaming tar falling out of the sky onto your heads, that's wild. Okay, so the Queen of Sheba is next up on the iceberg, and this is another biblical one of sorts. It's not fully biblical. This queen was likely to be the queen of the Sabian people from modern-day Yemen, and it was said that she brought precious stones, gold, and other stuff to King Solomon. She came to test his wisdom because he was basically Mr. Worldwide whenever it came to this. It was a mutual exchange, and they both gained mutual respect for each other, but one Ethiopian legend says that they might have gained a little bit too much respect for each other. One legend, which was likely started as an Ethiopian folktale, says that the Queen of Sheba, which was actually known as Queen Makeda of Ethiopia, had a child with King Solomon after this night. This little boy was named Menelik, and he started the Christian dynasty that ruled over Ethiopia until like last century, like 50 years ago. Now this whole story is probably just a legend, but the Queen of Sheba is like hugely historic and legendary in history. Next up, we have the question, what knowledge might have been lost whenever the Library of Alexandria burned down? So let's talk about the library first. This library was one of the most prestigious archives in the entirety of the world, and it was located in Alexandria, Egypt. This thing was burned 3 times, and the first time was actually the fault of Julius Caesar. During Caesar's civil war, with one side being led by him and the other by Pompey, Caesar was chasing this guy Pompey across different countries and seas. Well, he got his fleet of ships trapped in the harbor of Alexandria by some Ethiopian ships, and he had his men burn these ships. This fire was huge, and it actually caught part of the city on fire. It caught the Alexandrian library on fire and burned it partially. Later, Theophilus also had part of this library destroyed. Finally, Alexandria was taken over by Muslim forces at one point in time, and this leader, this guy named Caliph Omar, had them take all of the information, all the research, all of everything that was included in the library, take it out and burn it. Like, not just burn it, they burned it to start their bathhouses. Like crazy. Imagine just burning all this because it might go against your religion. It's ancient history. So basically everything that was ever accumulated in this library is lost to history forever. So what might have been lost in the fires? In a general sense, you got all these different things like philosophy, poetry, math, everything like that, medicine, could have been lost from these different cultures. This library did draw scholars from like all across the world. So there was probably information from Egypt, Rome, Persia, all the Arabian countries, Asia Minor, everything like that. Everything was probably compiled there and just burned. Ancient engineering techniques were probably there. And I'm looking at you, Egypt. There could have been text there talking about ancient aliens, that's a shot in the dark there. That's just me being a little bit crazy. But anyway, we don't know what was lost. Now, I do believe one thing though. If there was information there that was important enough to set humans back for like centuries, it probably wasn't just there. If this knowledge existed, it was probably known by different scholars all around, so it probably wasn't just lost. Other people knew it and they weren't there when the library burned down. They would have been fine. If this information had been known back then they probably would have used it to advance civilization even further. So probably anything that was lost wasn't that paramount to the society. So yes, tons of history and ancient philosophy and stuff like that was probably lost, but nothing world-breaking probably was. Alright, finally, we have the question, where was the Garden of Eden? Once again, if you're unaware of the biblical lore, the Garden of Eden was where Adam and Eve lived before Eve and Adam ate of the forbidden fruit and were cast out forever. In Genesis chapter 2, we see the Garden of Eden being in conjunction with 4 rivers, the Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates. Now, 2 of these I've actually heard of, the Tigris and Euphrates. Obviously, the Tigris and Euphrates have to do with ancient Mesopotamia, so you would instantly think that the Garden of Eden was there. Now, this is probably the most accepted theory because this is probably the most accurate, but where's the garden today? It's not there, obviously. There are many theories as to the answer to this, but many of them are supernatural, so I'm not going to dive too far down the rabbit hole, but I'm going to tell you these. Here's the supernatural one that I think is probably the most accurate, if any of them are. The Garden of Eden is protected by a cherub angel, as said in the book of Ezekiel, so it's probably hidden away from everybody's eyes so that we can't stumble upon this cherub angel and just get stabbed to death. Obviously, man is not going to be able to enter the Garden of Eden again if we believe the Bible, because we were cast out of that forever. So that's my thoughts on that part anyway. Anyway, there are several other places proposed as to where the Garden of Eden might have been located, but the funniest of these is that it might have been located in Jackson County, Missouri. I don't really know how that one works out. Now just imagine this. All of biblical events take place in like Northern Africa, Asia Minor, some places in Europe, all that kind of stuff. All those are the more important places, but for some reason, the most sacred and holy place in the entire world is in Missouri. Now, I'm from Arkansas, as you can tell from my hat. I wear this hat all the time because I'm a huge fan of the state. We call this place God's country because it's so pretty. It's called the natural state. Look at Northwest Arkansas. It's gorgeous. But imagine thinking the Garden of Eden is located here. That is delusional. Nothing from biblical times has anything to do with the North American continent, so just no. In any case, other theories pointed to places like Lebanon or Armenia, but this is one of those world mysteries we probably will never really know. First up on the iceberg, we have Cambyses' lost army. Now, Cambyses II was the son of Cyrus the Great, and he was the second emperor of the Achaemenid Empire that's of Persian origin. In the year 524 BC, Cambyses sent a troop of nearly 50,000 soldiers to take control of the Oracle of Ammon. Now, this Oracle of Ammon, you've probably never heard of it. I had never heard of it either. It was located at the Siwa Oasis in Egypt. See, Cambyses had been leading his Persian armies into Egypt to conquer the land, but it wasn't just conquering for the sake of conquering. To make a long story short, the Egyptian pharaoh at the time forced one of his own citizens, who was an eye doctor, to go live with Cambyses and the Persians because they wanted an eye doctor there in Persia where Cambyses was ruling. Now, Cambyses wasn't that serious. He wasn't like forcing this man to do this, but the pharaoh, he did. He forced his Egyptian citizen, who was an eye doctor, to go and live in Persia with Cambyses. Obviously, this Egyptian eye doctor did not take too well to this. He wasn't mad at the Persians, he was mad at the pharaoh because the pharaoh forced him to leave his family and go live off in Persia. So to stir up a little trouble, the eye doctor told Cambyses that he should ask the pharaoh for one of his daughters to marry, and so Cambyses does this. Now the pharaoh didn't want to send his own daughter after he, took that eye doctor away from his family, but anyway, as a stand-in for his own daughter, he sent the daughter of one of his political rivals that he had previously had executed. This daughter was forced to go marry Cambyses. Now obviously this daughter didn't like the way that Pharaoh just shipped her off to live with the emperor of Persia, so she told Cambyses that she is not the real daughter of Pharaoh. Now this made Cambyses extremely mad because the Pharaoh just completely lied and sent this girl who's not his daughter to marry him. So he launched the Persian invasion of Egypt to conquer it. Turnabout is indeed fair play. He defeated the pharaoh and then he started conquering all his land. Now to the topic at hand, the oracle at Ammon was in the Siwa Oasis, like I said. He sent these 50,000 troops there across the desert and they just disappeared. Nobody ever saw them again. Historians say that they were probably swallowed and engulfed by a massive sandstorm, and honestly, this kind of tracks. In 2009, after all these years, some Italian archaeologists were doing some excavating out there near the Siwa Oasis, and they found stuff that dated back to the Achaemenid period. So it could have been a massive sandstorm that swallowed up this army, and that's why we never heard from them again. But I like the theory a little bit better that a dune sandworm just swallowed them. But, it was probably the natural causes. It was probably a sandstorm. Now let's look at the Etruscan civilization and its origins. The Etruscans were a group of people that lived in central Italy from the 8th century BC to the 3rd century BC. It eventually fell to Rome, but much of its culture was preserved in the Roman Republic and then Empire. The funny thing about the Etruscans is that we typically think of them as existing in that time period that I just told you about, but in all actuality, they existed a long time before that as the Villanovans back at like 1000 BC. These people were native to the Etruria region in Italy, and they thrived during the Iron Age. During this time period, the Etruscans spent a lot of time preparing their dead for the afterlife. A massive necropolis that held 193 tombs was found. Now these bodies were obviously cremated because the remains were found in ceramic and pesto urns that were common to this time period. Anyway, the Etruscans were apparently indigenous to this area of central Italy, and they remained there until they were absorbed by Rome. Well, absorbed is technically the right word, but they did fight several wars against Rome before they finally, took them over. Now, it's also been theorized that they're not indigenous to Italy, and they actually are some of the ancient Pelasgians that lived in the Greece area and migrated to the Italian area. We really don't know for a fact either way. At the end of the day, the Etruscans created their own thriving society and culture, so that's really all that matters. These people predated Rome, but obviously they didn't outlive it. They even had their own polytheistic religion that was very similar to the Greek and Roman systems. They had their own language, art styles, alphabet, and even an oligarchic republic to rule them. They even teamed up with Carthage in a naval battle to beat Rome over some trade routes and stuff like that. The Etruscans honestly deserve their own video, so I'm not going to go too deep into the weeds here, but just know they were awesome. Next up on the iceberg, we have helicopter hieroglyphics. Now, these things are absolutely insane when you look at them for the first time. Now, obviously, these are ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, like duh, but upon first look, they look like a helicopter, a stealth fighter, and a submarine. So if you look back to my ancient Egyptian alien theory, we can honestly say that they were here and they had their technology everywhere. That's why we have helicopter hieroglyphics and submarines, stealth fighters, all this depicted on walls, right? Well, not quite. In all actuality, these things are probably present because of a sad misunderstanding of the hieroglyphs themselves. Basically what happened is that the pharaoh Seti I had hieroglyphs carved in his temple of Abydos, which is a town that's just west of the Nile in Egypt. Now his hieroglyphs that he originally had carved roughly translate to "He who repulses the 9 enemies of Egypt," and it looks like this. It's on screen. Later on, his direct successor Rameses II had his hieroglyphs covered up and his own carved into the wall there. His look like this and roughly translates to "He who protects Egypt and overthrows foreign countries." So similar messages, different wording. Now over time, the plaster stuff that covered Seti's hieroglyphics kind of just faded away, so the two carvings merged together, and that's why we see what we see. We don't actually see helicopters and submarines. There weren't actually aliens, probably. It was just a misunderstanding, and that saddens me. The Plague of Athens. This plague was some sort of infectious disease that killed from 75,000 to 100,000 Athenians in the year 430 BC. This plague was pretty sus because it happened on the second year of the Second Peloponnesian War, which makes me and many others believe that it might have been a viral attack against the Athenians. So if you're unfamiliar with the Peloponnesian Wars, this one in particular was a power struggle between Sparta and Athens, who were both Greek city-states at the time. This war literally lasted for 27 years until Persia stepped in support of Sparta for some reason. After that happened, obviously Sparta reigned supreme over the rest of the Greeks for a long time. Anyway, back to the plague. Athens was facing Sparta, right? And Sparta just had it like that. You know, they were goated. Everybody knows that Sparta was some of the greatest warriors ever. So what they did was they barricaded themselves inside the city walls of Athens. Obviously, Sparta laid outside and sieged them. It actually wasn't that bad for Athens because they had a major advantage, which was their port on the sea. They had a really good naval presence, whereas Sparta didn't have any. This port was called the Port of Piraeus, and they used it to bring in supplies and food as needed. Unfortunately for Athens, having that many people barricaded inside the city walls for that long a time with the awful sanitation conditions of the time, it was just a breeding ground for disease, and it led to this sickness. This plague hit the Athenian people 3 times in just 5 years, and it wiped out nearly 100,000 of the Athenians. So what exactly was the disease? Well, most people think it was either smallpox or typhoid fever or something like that, but obviously they didn't have the fancy technology and labs that we have nowadays to discuss and find all these things, so we really don't know. Whatever the disease was probably came through with the people that entered in the Port of Piraeus, the sick people, and just spread like wildfire because of the terrible sanitary conditions of the time. So one of the things that disproves the theory that it was a targeted viral attack is that it actually hit a bunch of other towns in the Mediterranean area around the same time, but it didn't completely ravage anybody like the Athenians because the Athenians were behind their own city walls in their terrible sanitary conditions. That's why it happened. Supposedly, the Spartans that were just outside the wall never caught the disease. They never had it at all, really. And that's a little bit sus to me. They could have sent it through the port, I guess. I really don't know. It could have been targeted. It could have not been. The Spartans were just like that, so you never know. In all actuality, this disease did run through ancient Egypt and Libya, so honestly, the Athenians just had tough luck. What in the world are shrunken heads? Shrunken heads are next up on this iceberg, and honestly, I had no idea what they were until I did this research, so let's talk about it. I want to talk about it, but I don't want to talk about it. To be honest, I wish I didn't know what they were. So what makes this thing popular in modern culture is that there were severely high bounties placed on individuals or groups of people in South America during like the 20th century. Obviously, not just the 20th century, before that too. All the Native American tribes and stuff like that. We're going to talk about it. Before the 20th century, there were groups in the Amazon rainforest, which spans from the north part of Peru to the eastern part of Ecuador. These people placed an emphasis on slaying their enemies, beheading them, and bringing their bodies and heads back to camp so they could shrink the head and acquire the soul of the one they killed. This was a process highly valued by the indigenous tribes of the area, which are the Shuar, Achuar, Huambisa, and Agurana peoples. I read that off my notes, and I can't even say it when I'm reading it, so I'm sorry. I'm not trying to offend anybody. To shrink the head, you must behead a person, remove the skin from the top of their head, sew the mouth shut, boil the entire skull, and dry it with sand and hot rocks while keeping the scalp formed with your hands. This is one of the most disturbing things I've ever read in my entire life. And I've read Baraska. Once they're shrunk, these things are called sansas, and they actually had several uses back in the day. First of all, these things were obviously used as trophies by the ones who did the slaying and the shrinking of the heads. They also had spiritual meanings. Like I said earlier, this helps them to collect the soul of the one that they killed, but it also helps them to ward off the vengeful Musak spirits. Later on in this culture, Westerners started to colonize this area, as Westerners do, and they started paying good money for these things, these shrunken heads. Well, the thing about this was they either paid in money or they traded one head for one firearm. That's what we need. Tribes with firearms whenever you're trying to colonize an area. That just sounds genius by the colonizers. Now, naturally, because the Westerners are incentivizing the killings because they're paying money or giving them guns, this increased the rate of the killings. It got horrible to the point where the Ecuadorian and Peruvian governments literally stopped it and outlawed the practice, which should have been done so long ago it's not even funny. This should never have been a legal thing. I guess you can't police these people when they live out in the rainforest, but it's crazy. It kind of reminds me of the scalping practice that happened in the American West in Mexico back in the day in the Wild Wild West. That happened too. If you've read Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, you know what I'm talking about. It's just awful. At least for the shrunken heads, you can say there was an art to it. There was literally artistic practices they went through to do this, but scalping, they just cut the scalp off and turned it in. Whatever. The Villa of the Mysteries. This is a very well preserved villa in Pompeii that was once covered by the eruption from Mount Vesuvius like the rest of Pompeii. It was excavated in 1909 and it's been a very popular tourist attraction ever since, but why is that? Well, it's full of beautiful and suspicious fresco paintings. It was once a winery and it's just gorgeous. Oh yeah, and it's one of the largest villas in all of Pompeii. The real attraction is these frescoes because they're so suspicious, like I said. Apparently they were associated with the cult of Dionysus, and if you don't know who Dionysus was, he was basically the Greek god of partying and wine. This makes a lot of sense because, like I said, this villa was a winery once upon a time, so Dionysus, winery, kind of intertwined there. Also, on a side note, the cult of Dionysus was into some really weird stuff. Like, they were into violent group activities, if you know what I'm saying. They sacrificed animals, and they also had like strangely hypnotic plays and performances that went on. It was really weird. Anyway, the floors and the walls of this place are decked out with these frescoes. Like, every wall has like a panel that fits in a sequential story if you kind of analyze the frescoes. I'll tell you right now about this interpretation of the frescoes that I found on melbourneartclass.com. I'll leave a link in the description for that because I didn't come up with this. Obviously, I'm not an artist. I don't analyze this stuff. Well, I guess I do analyze stuff for a living, but not art. Anyway, in the first scene, a boy before a priestess reads off a scroll while the initiate, which is a woman, and she's obviously being initiated into the cult of Dionysus, she enters the room with a wreath and a tray of food. In the second scene, this priestess, an initiate, and an assistant read a basket while Silenus, who was a horseman or something from local lore, he's playing a lyre. The third scene shows the initiate in a dramatic pose like she's establishing a connection with the cult or something, and then the next couple scenes show that initiate disappear like she's gone to the underworld or something to do with the cult of Dionysus. They do some more weird stuff. Dionysus appears, the initiate comes back and gets whipped for some reason, and then they all party. Cults were weird, even back in the day. It's kind of crazy how that works. Why do so many mythologies have flood myths? Alright, so the Great Flood is literally a tale as old as time. Christianity presents the Great Flood as a cleansing act that cleansed the earth of all the sinners and all the corruption, everything but Noah and the animals he took on his ark, and his family obviously. But after that, it's a clean slate for the world. Noah brought his family and 2 of every animal onto the ark with him. They waited a year and that was that. They started over. Now, I didn't actually know this because I'm not very cultured outside of Christianity, if you want me to be completely honest, but other religions and mythologies have this great flood rumor too. There are ancient Mesopotamian accounts of this, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Akkadian Atrahasis or the Sumerian Great Flood as well. These all have similar implications that a hero survives the great cleansing of the world via flood. Surprisingly enough, the Hindu also have a version of this. Vishnu's avatar warns the first man of a great flood, and it comes and he survives. Zoroastrianism, which we talked about in the very first Iceberg video, also has its own version of this. Plato's Timaeus has a great flood story, and so do many of the North American native tribes. So why does everybody have one of these? Well, it's probably because a great flood happened. Flood myths that date all the way back to the last glacial period still survive to this day, and it's like almost confirmed that it happened. If you want to get scientific with it, there's an archaeologist that states that there could have been great oceanic asteroid impacts that caused great tsunamis all across the world, and all these different cultures remember these tsunamis as great floods. Also, most ancient civilizations were built in great floodplains due to the fertility of the soil. If your civilization is built in a floodplain, then it's likely that you're going to experience floods. So that kind of ties all that back together, that everybody's going to have a flood. As far as the religious implications of this, obviously these religions present the flood as a great cleansing of the world. As man grew violent and corrupt, God saw that Noah was virtuous and he deserved to live, him and his family both. So if he would do as God said and follow his specs to building the ark, he would survive. He would save the rest of humanity and they would continue on. This same question and story of morality was presented in other religions as well, so obviously that's why they all have these same stories. If there's a worldly myth that fits along with a religious concept, then they are all going to have similar concepts in their civilizations. Now, whether it actually happened or not, I think it did, but we don't really know how exactly it went down. But that explains the question that's posed by the iceberg. The Phaistos disc. This is a fired clay disc that has inscriptions and symbols on it that were never deciphered. Like many other things on this list, it dates back to the ancient Minoans of Crete. It dates back to over 3,000 years ago, and it was found in the palace at Phaistos. It's only 6 inches in diameter, but it has 45 unique symbols and 241 total, I believe. Like most ancient scripts, it has some symbols that represent plants, animals, and tools and things of that nature, but there's some that are completely unintelligible to us. Listen to this. Some scholars argue that it was probably a precursor to the ancient Greek language because obviously the Minoan civilization went on to inspire the Mycenaean culture, but others argue that it could have been ancient Hittite or even Egyptian. They really don't know what's going on. There's great debate about whether or not it even originated from Crete because some people believe, based on the pottery style, that it was actually brought in and just left on the floor of the palace. It's another one of those things that we will never know for a fact. Ever-burning lamps were a phenomenon reported by many different authors across time and across the world in general. Plutarch was a Greek philosopher that lived in the 1st century AD. He wrote about an ever-burning lamp outside the temple of Jupiter Ammon in Egypt, and he said that it could not be put out by wind or rain. A lot of other temples were rumored to have ever-burning lamps like this, as was the Roman king Numa Pompilius. It was supposed to aid in his power or something like that. There were other accounts of these things, such as one burning over the city gates of Antioch that was said to have burned for over 500 years. And there was another one that was located inside of an Egyptian temple that Christians thought to be of the devil, because of course they did. I say they, like I'm not a Christian as well. I just don't have strange beliefs like some Christians, I think. When I'm telling you that every single ancient civilization had at least one on record of these ever-burning lamps, I'm not lying. Emperor Constantine's father's tomb supposedly held one of these ever-burning lamps at one point in time. Even the Hindu have a story of one of these ever-burning lamps that had been burning in the Himalayas since the beginning of time. So, were these things real? Probably not. Fire needs fuel, heat, and oxygen to burn. No matter how you design a lamp, it's always going to run out of fuel unless it's being constantly fed fuel, like the eternal flame of JFK's grave in the Arlington National Cemetery. It's being constantly fed natural gas, and that's why it never goes out. But this eternal flame at JFK's grave has a spark mechanism that will relight it if it goes out. Some of these in the ancient times that they say weren't put out by wind or rain, I don't believe it. But some could have been actually there. If it would have been burning, it would have been put out by wind or rain. But if it was resparked, there you go. I'm yapping in this video. This is crazy. Basically, what I'm trying to say by beating around the bush like this, talking in circles, is that if there was one that occurred in nature, it would have had to been a spark outside of a deep pocket of natural gas. And that pocket of natural gas would have been slowly feeding it for all the time, but it would have still gone out by wind or rain unless it was resparked. And in nature, it's not going to be resparked like that. The only other explanation I have for this is alien technology. The Indus script. This was an ancient script that belonged to the people of the Indus Valley civilization in the Bronze Age. Now, this civilization took part in what is now known as parts of India, Persia, and Afghanistan. They're also called the Harappan people because there was a great excavation at the site of Harappa that had a bunch of their stuff from their culture from way back when. Now, this script has been found on over 4,000 objects, and it contains a unique 400 characters. That's a large alphabet. Now, obviously, alphabet is not how these things used to work, but still, pictorials, anything. 400's a lot to be unique symbols. Now, these things are mostly pictorial in nature, so you think we could look at the pictures and kind of decipher what they are, but we're really not that lucky. So what exactly is stopping us from figuring this out, you may ask? Well, I'll tell you. We don't even know the spoken language of the Harappan people, so that right there is a major issue. So you remember how I said there were over 400 unique symbols in this script? Well, that's true, but just 67 of these characters make up over 80% of the writing that was found on all the objects. In percentages, that's like if 4 letters of the alphabet, say A, B, C, or D, made up over 80% of all of our writing that some civilization way in the future found. That's a crazy percentage. That makes it virtually impossible to transcribe all of that. Also, the inscriptions are very short, with the average being only 5 characters in length, with the longest being 34. Obviously, no Rosetta Stone that we can transcribe all the symbols has been found yet, so we're kind of just up a creek without a paddle. Now I got some good news for you. January 16th, 2025, which is very, very recent to whenever I'm recording this video, a member of the Indian government announced a $1 million reward to anyone who could decipher this script. So basically, if you're good with code and languages and linguistics and everything like that, you could make yourself a chunk of change if you figured this out, and everybody in the world would thank you. Well, not everybody in the world, because not everybody in the world cares, but I would thank you. We're starting this off with an absolute banger. Rome's secret name. Now, obviously, the ancient Romans provide us with great examples of what to do and what not to do with our civilization, but this is basically just a fun fact about the empire that you may not know. The city of Rome actually had 3 names. The public name Rome, the religious name Florens, and the third, which is the secret name. Now, there were several different names that people said could be the secret name of Rome, but before we actually get into naming those, let's talk about why it had a secret name at all. Ancient cultures had some weird traditions and superstitions about naming places or things. They basically thought that if someone knows the name of something, then they have power over that thing. There are tons of examples of this in history, such as like the Jewish god not being named because nobody actually spoke his name aloud. Another example you're probably familiar with is from the Odyssey, whenever Odysseus fights the Cyclops Polyphemus or Polyphemus, however you say that. But anyway, he calls himself Nobody because he didn't want him to know his name. Another Greek story shows that Orpheus controlled the creatures of the underworld by calling their name. You can see where I'm going with this. The Romans didn't want their enemies to know the name of their city, like the secret name, because it would give them power over the city and over the patron god of the city. Now, this patron god supposedly could be invoked and then he would take care of the city walls and the city, Rome, whatever. Calling on the patron god of the city was known as the rite of evocation, and it was only undertaken by like the highest ranking government officials in Rome. Obviously, this means that only those people were supposed to know the secret name of Rome. The poet Giovanni Pascoli believes that the secret name of Rome was its palindrome back in the day. It would have been amor, which means love. This love or amor ties Rome back to the goddess Venus, which was the goddess of love, you know, Aphrodite, basically, just the Roman version of her. She had a literal cult following in Rome, so that's probably where some of this came from. Another theory says that the name was Maya. Maya was one of 7 sisters who were the daughters of Atlas in Greek and Roman mythology. These 7 sisters ties it back to the 7 hills of Rome on which it was built and all that kind of stuff. If you know Roman geography, then you know what I'm talking about. If you don't really worry about it. It's kind of complicated. Now, obviously, we don't know which one of these interpretations was true. We don't know if either one of them is the right secret name of Rome, but we know that the Romans didn't play with this. The Roman poet Ovid was exiled from Rome for life, and there's a really good chance that it was for speaking the secret name of Rome aloud, which, that's terrible. All right, we're sticking with Rome here. The death of Romulus. If you happen to not know who Romulus was, it's kind of in his name. He was the original founder and king of Rome alongside his brother Remus. These twins were said to be born to the lady Rhea Silvia and the Roman god of war Mars. Now, they were actually ordered to be executed whenever they were babies because they were both heirs in the line of succession to the throne of Alba Longa, because Rhea Silvia's father was the king of Alba Longa. Now, if you haven't heard of Alba Longa, it's a city near the future site of Rome. It's like 12 miles or something like that, give or take a little bit. Whenever they were ordered executed, people just set them in a river and expected them to die, kind of like Moses, you know. But anyway, a woodpecker and a she-wolf found them and took care of them. The she-wolf actually nursed them, so that's a little disturbing to think about. It's a little disturbing, but it's probably one of the coolest origin stories ever, so you know. Now, these twins grew up. They actually survived and thrived after being suckled by the she-wolf. They were raised up. They went back to Alba Longa and executed the king that ordered them to be executed when they were babies, and that returned their grandpa to power in Alba Longa. After all that, they went on their quest to found their own city, and that became Rome. Not long after all that happened, Romulus decided to off his brother Remus, so he became the sole king and ruler of Rome. Now, he went on to be a really hard-nosed ruler, but his hard-nosedness actually was more for his own people instead of the people like his enemies. It's actually kind of bad the way they portray him. He was not good to his people, but he was lenient to these outsiders. Well, I say that, but he was also the one that orchestrated the abduction of Sabine women. Like all these people from this Sabine city or culture or whatever it was, he invited them all in. They had a big party and everything, and then all of the Roman men just abducted these Sabine women so they could repopulate Rome because they didn't have any women. Obviously, since Rome was just founded, it was only like adventurous people and friends of Romulus and Remus. Well, rest in peace, Remus. But anyway, all of their friends. So it was basically just guys. They didn't have any women really to repopulate the city. As a result, they wanted these women to be brought in and forced to stay there so they could repopulate. Now, the Sabines were obviously mad about this, so they decided that they were going to start a war with Rome. But before it actually got to that, these women that had been abducted stepped in and said that they would willingly stay in Rome if they just didn't get into a war and all their people die. After all this, it was all merry and good. The Sabine people actually joined Rome, and their king, who was Tatius, I believe, he joined Romulus as a co-king. Now, why Titus thought this was a good idea, I don't really know, because literally Romulus had just offed his own brother Remus because he wanted to be the sole king. So what did he expect to happen? Well, It happened. He was executed, and as a result, Romulus decided not even to punish the people that executed him. He just let them walk. He didn't want to be a co-king. He wanted to be the sole ruler. This upset the Sabine people, but what could they really do? They were mad, but they weren't the only ones who hated Romulus. After defeating Veii, which was an Etruscan city, Rome actually took like 50 hostages from the city so they would have diplomatic power over the Etruscans. For some reason, Romulus decided to just let them go. Here's back to that lenient to outsiders thing. He just let them go. At the same time as this, he was sitting here sentencing his own people, like some brigands or whatever, to unworthy deaths. They were executed for petty crimes. Also, he eventually inherited his grandpa's throne of Alba Longa, which you can expect because he was the heir, but after all that, he just gave it up. He let the magistrates in the city rule it. He was more concerned about policing his own citizens within their walls and just scrutinizing everything they did. As a result of all these different people hating him, there is an account of his death that says that all of his senators surrounded him in the Senate building and stabbed him to death, chopped his body up into little pieces, and carried him out under their clothes so that they didn't start an uprising, like people didn't see them carry out a dead body, that they had just murdered him. Obviously, that's not a very good account of his death, but it's the more believable one of the two, which is surprising. The other one says that Romulus was watching a Roman military parade, and out of nowhere, a massive thunderstorm and black cloud came down. This cloud completely engulfed Romulus and took him up to heaven, and it was actually his father Mars who took him up there. They said he became known as a god named Quirinus, and that was it. So you can decide what you believe if either one of these is true. I really don't know if Romulus was even a real person. He's kind of just a folklore hero. He probably wasn't real, but that's for you to decide. Next up, where is Cleopatra's tomb? Alright, so this is talking about the Cleopatra that was the most famous, Cleopatra the 7th, the Cleopatra that had dealings with both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. We're really on a Roman kick here. I didn't compile this list. This is actually from the Ancient Mysteries of the World Iceberg from user/oldthrace, I believe, on Reddit. So give him some love there. Now, her dealings with Julius Caesar produced her son Caesarion, who was like the last pharaoh of Egypt, the last real pharaoh anyway. Her dealings with Mark Antony produced 3 children: Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene II, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. Now, this association with Mark Antony is what eventually led to her death. So, after Julius Caesar's death, his nephew Octavian banded together with Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus to form a Roman triumvirate of power. A triumvirate of Roman power. I think that's how it's supposed to say that. Eventually, Octavian turned on Mark Antony, and Mark Antony had been living in Egypt with his woman Cleopatra. Now, Octavian's forces defeated Cleopatra and Antony's in a naval battle, and as he began his invasion of Egypt, they made a decision. Cleopatra poisoned herself, and Mark Antony stabbed himself, and this led to both of their deaths. Octavian would go on to be the all-powerful Augustus, and he actually had Cleopatra's son with Julius Caesar, Caesarion, executed because he didn't want that line of succession to lead to further strife because he was all-powerful now. Now, one good thing that Augustus did in this story is he allowed Mark Antony and Cleopatra to be buried together honorably. Now, the problem with this is what the question in the iceberg says. We have no idea where this tomb is today. Now, there are several theories about this, but the most common and believed is that it was probably in ancient Alexandria, Egypt, which is now mostly underwater. There's been tons of excavations and dives and everything like that to try to find it, but no luck yet. Now, there is another theory, and it's pretty good. It says that since Cleopatra was supposed to be the human embodiment of the goddess Isis, she's probably buried in a temple of Isis. They placed the most likely temple in the city of Taposiris Magna, which is a city southwest of Alexandria. Now, for like the past 20 years or so, there's been an archaeologist named Kathleen Martinez who's been excavating over there and trying to find tombs and everything like that. She has found 27 tombs in the area so far, but no confirmation of Cleopatra, just some artifacts and stuff like that. Maybe one day we'll actually find this tomb. Missing poets from the epic cycle. So the epic cycle is a group of epic poems from ancient Greece that tell the story of creation all the way up until the end of the Trojan War. Now, these are considered missing epics because Homer's Iliad and Odyssey are like the only 2 that survived that were in the cycle at all. As a matter of fact, most scholars say that Homer's don't even count. Like, these 2 are not in the epic cycle because we know them. They actually call it the epic cycle to distinguish it from the Homerian works. They don't even agree on which lost books to include in the cycle, so they're just all confused. It doesn't make any sense. There are different eras in the cycle, and some scholars only include the ones of Trojan origin, actually. Here's a list of all the books in order that I found on the website livius.org. Titanomachy, Oedipus, Phoebus, Epigone, Cypria, Iliad, Aethiopus, Little Iliad, Sack of Troy, Returns, Odyssey, and Telegony. Now, these epics supposedly all tell a sequential story and build on each other. Now, it's said that every educated person in ancient Greece knew all of these works, but the closest we'll ever get is the Homerian epics and the retelling of the stories in stories that weren't lost to time. The Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a collection of Jewish scrolls that date all the way back to the 3rd century BC to the 1st century AD. They're also known as the Qumran Cave Scrolls because they were found in 11 caves near Qumran. Now they contain lots of copies of biblical scripts, but they also have scripts and just other records and stuff that existed outside of biblical teachings. Most of these date back to the Second Temple period, which was, you know, when the Second Temple was built after the destruction of the first. These are the temples in Jerusalem, by the way. Books of the Bible that were actually written during this time period include Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and Daniel. Now, outside of the biblical scripts that we were talking about, there's some extra biblical scripts like the non-canon stuff. There was the complete book of Jubilees within the scrolls. Some of the scrolls are referred to as sectarian because they go through like the beliefs and views of a certain sect of Jewish history. There was a Jewish culture named SNA. This community's views and stuff make up the majority of like the extra biblical scripts and opinionated pieces that are in the scrolls. Now these scrolls were mostly written on parchment, with a few being on papyrus and one actually being engraved in copper. Alright, so here's the breakdown of the scrolls. 40% of them were biblical scripts, 30% are apocryphal texts, and the rest are the sectarian scripts that I mentioned. Now there were also some scrolls found outside of the Qumran cave system, and these are still considered part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are much longer ranging in time because some of them date all the way back to the 8th century BC and range all the way up to like the 11th century AD. Most of them though were written in the Roman days. There were legal documents, financial documents, military records, and other scripts like this recorded. Some of these actually originated during the Bar Kokhba revolt in Rome. It was a Jewish revolt against the Roman government. This revolt happened during the 2nd century AD and it failed really badly, so these scrolls were likely from the Jewish refugees from Rome during that time period. The Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is a collection of monolithic stones from around 11,000 years ago that still stand today in southeastern Turkey. It's theorized that these monolithic stones once served as man's first temple or holy place. Now these stones stand as pillars and they're arranged in a circular pattern. Now they have carvings of human-like figures, animals, plants, and other things like that, even clothes, so it kind of paints a picture of the time period for us. Speaking of the time period, it was thought that these people lived here from the year like 9500 BC all the way to 8000 BC, so a good 1500 year time span. These T-shaped pillars are said to be some of the first human architecture like ever discovered, so that's pretty cool. Now these people were thought to be hunter-gatherers who lived in villages, hunted gazelles, and ate some cereal grains too. A little bit of farming there. Anyway, there are 4 of these circular patterns currently unearthed, and geological surveys say that there are 16 more down there that are yet to be excavated. So these people were getting with it. Each of these circles contained about 8 pillars around the edges, with 2 taller stones standing in the middle facing each other. They were like 5.5 meters tall. All of these pillars are made up of limestone, and it's said that these people probably used flint-based tools to carve them up. This would take a long time to accomplish, but obviously they did. One really cool theory about the Göbekli Tepe is that it was actually part of the Garden of Eden or the Tower of Babel, either one, because the Tower of Babel is kind of a man-made structure of stone. But anyway, it was thought to be in the same general area as the Garden of Eden was thought to be back in the day. We obviously don't know if this is true. We don't know where the Garden of Eden was. That was on the very first iceberg, but I don't know either way, but it'd be really cool if it was associated with biblical events. The Indus Valley Civilization. The Indus Valley Civilization is naturally a group of people who lived in the Indus Valley. Now this is a place in southern Asia that takes up part of like modern India, like all of Pakistan and part of Afghanistan. This civilization flourished during the Bronze Age before the inevitable Bronze Age collapse. Now it's important to note that these people are also referred to as the Harappan people because the site Harappa was where all of their artifacts and everything else like that were excavated originally. The Harappan people had their own script known as the Indus script, which I actually covered in the last video, but here's the gist of it. Nobody has deciphered the script yet, so there's tons to learn about these people that's sitting right there, but we just can't read it. Now this civilization was one of the great 3 ancient civilizations along with like Egypt and Mesopotamia, but we don't know as much about them because we can't read their language. Speaking of the ancient Mesopotamians, these people used very similar irrigation methods for farming, like advanced agriculture. These people farmed wheat, barley, peas, mustard, sesame, cotton, even some dates back in their day. As far as meat sources go, they had the standard cattle, birds, pigs, but they also had like buffalo and camels. They even had Asian elephants because they used their tusks, like the ivory from them, for trading purposes. These people had some very fine craftsmanship. They had it out of bronze, soapstone, stuff like that. They had carvings of people, chariots, animals, everything. Their most common form of art though was their terracotta figurines. There's there's been lots and lots of this pottery found, and there's also been a lot of seals with their Indus script found, but like I keep saying, we can't read it. As I already mentioned, they had a lot of copper and bronze tools, but they also used gold, silver, and even lead, so they were pretty good with metals. Now, apparently cities within the Indus Valley were incredible. They apparently had a very good understanding of urban planning because they had cities that actually make sense, but they also had really good drainage systems within them. This system allowed for like a very, very efficient disposal of sewage, which helped the hygiene of the people because they actually focused on the hygiene of the people then. It's said that these ancient systems of like sewage disposal and all that kind of stuff are even more efficient and better than the ones that are in the same area today. But obviously I can't attest to this. I'm not a part of that society. That's for them to decide. I can only report what people say on the internet. Anyway, their homes were baked brick, like that terracotta stuff I was talking about, all their pottery. They had bricks and they had pretty nice homes. All that said, the Indus Valley civilization is very interesting, so I hope one day the Indus scripts cracked. Maybe we can actually learn some more about these people. Sappho's lost poems refer to a group of lost lyrical poems or musical poems that Sappho wrote. Now, Sappho was an ancient Greek poet that lived from the year 630 BC to 570 BC. Now, only one of her poems lives to this day, that being her Ode to Aphrodite. Now, this poem is written as a prayer to Aphrodite for her help in attracting a woman that the speaker really, really wants to attract. It's really important to note that the person to be attracted is referred to as feminine, and the speaker is designated as Sappho herself. Now, this broke a lot of boundaries about sexuality back in the time, and even up to this point, female homosexuality is referred to as lesbian because Sappho hailed from the Greek island of Lesbos. It's derived from that. So there's you some historical trivia you might not have known. Despite all of that, it's said that Sappho ended her own life because of an unrequited love for a man named Phaon. So there's that. Now, as for her lost poetry, it's said that she wrote over 10,000 lines of poetry in her day, but only 650 survived to this day. Now, that's pretty terrible. Can you imagine your life's work being reduced to 6.5% of what it was? Well, now that I think about it, that's probably not that bad. That's probably a pretty decent percentage. We all work our entire lives, and within 4 to 5 generations, nobody remembers our name or that we even existed. We're just ancestors. 6.5% of all the wisdom that you wish to impart on the world surviving after all that time is actually not that bad. Anyway, sorry to get all nihilistic or whatever that was on you, but her works were said to have been compiled in Alexandria at one point. But we all know what happens to literature and tombs and basically everything that happens in Alexandria. That place is just a black hole. Erased to history. I mean, the library literally burned 3 times. That's crazy. Other than that, only fragments of her work have survived. Certain church factions have obviously decided to try and erase her presence from history because of her supposed sexuality, so that didn't help anything at all either. Alright, the mystery of the elongated skulls. The mystery of the elongated skulls refers to a mystery in which skulls were found in like Peru and different places across civilizations, but anyway, they were found to have deformed and long skulls. Besides Peru, they were found in like the rest of the Americas. They were found in Australia, Europe, basically everywhere. There were a few, but the question remains how and why. Well, the how is actually pretty simple. When babies are first born, their skulls are very flexible and moldable. A process known as artificial cranial deformation takes place by binding the head of children between like 2 hard boards or like with a really, really tight cloth so that it elongates their skull and molds it. It's said to take about 6 months for this process to work, but whenever it works, it works. Now, these misshapen heads from this process are the ones that we found. As for the why, that's a little bit trickier, and we probably would never do the same thing in today's society. The most common explanation is that in these ancient societies, having an elongated head was a status symbol. If one had one of these elongated skulls, it was said that they were one of the elites in these ancient societies, especially in ancient Peru. Several different lines of king's skulls that were found in Europe also had these things, so I guess this wasn't exclusive to South America like we've been saying. So overall, it pretty much just signified that they were part of a group or they had a high status in that society that they were a part of. So it's really not as mysterious as the iceberg makes it out to be. Where is the Ark of the Covenant? Now, this mystery on the iceberg is pretty straightforward. Where is the Ark? This thing that once embodied the most concentrated source of God's power on earth ever. This thing completely vanished from history whenever Babylon invaded Jerusalem in the 6th century. So where in the world did this thing go? That's the 6th century BC, by the way. It wasn't like 600 AD. One story says that the thing was stolen during the days of King Solomon. See, Solomon supposedly had an an affair with the Queen of Sheba, and this affair spawned Menelik. Now, Menelik would go on to found the Christian dynasty that would rule over all of Ethiopia until like last century. This dynasty reigned for a long time. Anyway, Menelik resided in Jerusalem with his father for a time, but whenever he decided to leave, his companions that were with him decided that it would be a great idea to steal the Ark of the Covenant. Menelik didn't even know that his companions did this, but once he did, he decided to take it to the city of Axum. Ever since then, the Ark has been held under lock and key in the Church of St. Mary in Zion by this Ethiopian sect of the Christian church. Now, nobody knows if this is true because literally nobody is allowed to go in there. Like, not a single person can go into the Ark's resting place. I guess it could be there. Now, there is another account which is in the book of Maccabees, which is one of those apocryphal texts that I talked about earlier. It says that Jeremiah knew that Babylon was fixing to invade Jerusalem, and before that happened, he took the Ark of the Covenant out of Jerusalem and he buried it in a cave. This would actually make more sense to me because it actually happened whenever the Ark disappeared from all of history, so kind of makes sense, but come on, man, in a cave. There are several other explanations as to where the Ark is today, but none of them make enough logical sense to even mention, so it was probably one of these two. Or it's just gone forever. This is one of those mysteries we will never know because nobody's ever going to find it. It's been too long. Well, I say that, but if it's of divine origin, it could still be there in perfect condition. I don't know. They found monolithic stones from 11,000 years ago. I need to shut up. We're going to start this thing off with ancient automatons. So to start with, we probably need to know what are automatons. Automatons can be defined as mechanical objects that once they're set in motion, they continuously stay in motion. They do their own thing. In today's world, you might think of AI or robots because that's basically what it is. What you probably don't know is that these automatons go back all the way to 1000 BC in China. Now, this specific automaton was supposedly like a life-size human figurine of a mechanical object. He walked, he talked, and he flirted with women because why not? You know, if you got it like that, you got it like that. Naturally, the Chinese king at the time didn't like this, so he destroyed it, but anyway, that was that. Now, within the construction of this automaton was like the basic stuff. There was wood, leather, glue, all the stuff that was natural to have in mechanical objects of the time. But what you wouldn't expect to find is the artificial organs that were inside this thing. It said that it had like all of the organs, and that's why it walked and talked and did what it did. Now, obviously, this makes you think that it probably wasn't true, and it was just a tall tale. It was ancient China after all, and they had nothing better to talk about, but you can think what you want to think. It probably wasn't real. Ancient Greece had its fair share of automatons, and a lot of them actually were real because they were like legitimately documented. Archytas was a Greek mathematician and mechanical engineer that dealt with these types of things, and he had some of these inventions of his own. It said that he made a mechanical dove that was made of like mechanical objects, counterweights, stuff like that, so that it would fly, and it did. Now, this one too may not have been real, but these next ones definitely were. The Antikythera mechanism is a device that was said could predict like stars movements and eclipses and stuff like that, and it was so advanced that they call it the world's first analog computer. It has 37 bronze gears so that it could, you know, do all this fancy stuff, and it was pretty awesome. Now, like I said, we know this thing is real because it was found in a shipwreck off the coast of Antikythera. As you would expect, the ancient Greeks weren't done yet. Hero of Alexandria was an ancient mathematician and inventor, also of Greek origin, kind of Hellenistic, either way. It said that he made over 10 of his own inventions, 10 automata. It said that he invented the Ellipoli, which I probably butchered the pronunciation of that, but anyway, it was basically the first steam engine. He created a water vending machine for some reason. He created a wind-powered organ, and he also created like float valves like you might see on livestock watering troughs that fill up with water, and once the water depletes, it fills up until the float fills back up. You can tell. I just realized that a lot of you probably don't deal with livestock, but you probably have like dogs or something, and they make automatic waterers for dogs as well. It's just a float valve that makes sure something stays full of water. We still use them to this day, so that's pretty awesome. The Arabic inventor Al-Jazari lived in the 12th century, and he created a bunch of like the traditional automata that you might think about, kind of robot style. He created a drink serving waitress that was an automata, and he also created a hand washing assistant, which why do you need that? I really don't know, but anyway, he made some more too. He made not one but two entire robot bands that played at like rich people get-togethers. Now, the stuff that he made was kind of unnecessary in my opinion, but it's pretty awesome. Like, imagine showing up to a party and there's a whole robot band sitting over there playing for some reason, and you've never even seen a robot before, so it's kind of just weird. Obviously, these things were shocking for the people back then, but the further we get in time, the more humanoid in nature and just normal these things get to us. Like, now we have robots and AI. It's pretty incredible that they had even what they had back in the day, but if you think about it, all technology has to lead back to somewhere, so we're just reaping the benefits of everything these people were creating all the way back then. The Gundestrup Cauldron. The Gundestrup Cauldron is a silver bowl that was found in Denmark in the year 1891 that was absolutely full, like panel to panel, of art and inscriptions inscriptions and things like that. And I say panel to panel because it was made of little panels that they had to place back together. Now, the origin of the cauldron still remains a massive mystery to this day. If you look at the base of the bowl, you'll see a bull, 3 dogs, and a woman wielding a sword. Now, as I was saying, the round sides of the bowl were created in 7 little panels that just curve and then you solder them together. So it's not like a one-piece bowl like we tend to think of. It's in pieces, you know? It broke apart over time. Now, I said that it was made of 7 panels on the round side, but it was probably actually made of 8 because it's a little bit small. The 7 panels that were found on accident. Like, nobody knew they were there. They were found by some people harvesting the peat out of the swamps of Denmark. Anyway, the 7 plates that were found depict men with different animals, such as dragons and horned serpents, griffins, which are lions with bird heads, elephants, and other feline creatures. One panel shows a goddess surrounded by all types of creatures, and another panel shows gods and goddesses in all kinds of different activities. Now, this right here is why the origin is such a mystery. The whole thing in craftsmanship screamed that the Thracian silversmiths were the ones who created this bowl. The techniques in silver molding and tin soldering were definitely of like Thracian metalworker origin, but the artwork depicts a bunch of Celtic mythology. Celtic helmets, war trumpets, and religious depictions make up the entirety of the artwork. As a matter of fact, this thing is so thorough with its depictions of the Celtic mythos that it's said that this thing kind of serves as like a Rosetta Stone for the ideology. Alright, so the most common theory about the origins of the bowl is this. Somewhere like Romania or Bulgaria, there were a bunch of Thracians and Celtics living in tandem with each other, like they live same towns or really nearby, and they traded with each other. Like the Thracians did this silversmithing for the Celtics in return for something else. We don't know what that was, but that's probably what happened. The 2 cultures were living in tandem with each other and they combined to create this great bowl. Now, how this thing ended up in Denmark is a great question because Denmark is pretty much as far north in Europe as you can get from places like Bulgaria and Romania, so you know, we really don't know how it got there. The full story of the Gendestrup cauldron will probably never be known to us, but we do know that its origins, the silversmithing and the art, and you know, the culmination of everything that it took to create this thing and then somehow get it to Denmark makes for a great story for people like me to talk about on the internet. The Long Man of Wilmington. The Long Man is a massive figure of a man holding 2 staves, something like that. Anyway, it looks like it's carved into the side of a hill near Wilmington, England. Now, whenever I say this thing is massive, I do mean it. It's over 200 feet tall, and it has correct proportions when looking at it from afar or above. Now, it looks like it's carved into the size of the hill, but these days, restorationists actually have painted bricks around the outline of the man that they replace quite frequently and repaint different colors or stuff like that, just to keep the thing alive. Originally, this thing looked more like a shadow or an indentation of the grass, but the British people wanted to keep this thing alive. They don't want the grass to grow over it and it just fade away, so you can't hate the restoration efforts that they've gone over. So who exactly were the people that originally indented this thing in the grass? Like, why is the Long Man actually there? Here's where the restoration causes problems. It's actually really hard to tell who did it because it's been so many years and so many times the thing's been redone. The earliest account that we have of the Long Man was 1710, and the guy that wrote about him said that he had like eyes, a beard, and tools. Obviously, he doesn't have this stuff anymore. He just has his 2 staves, so that much has changed at least. People originally thought that the Long Man originated in the Iron Age or even the Neolithic period, but it's literally impossible to actually date this thing because all the artifacts around it that have been dug up, they're artifacts from every single time period because the British place, England, has been inhabited for so long that it's really impossible to tell. These days, the scientists think that it was probably from the early modern period, so like the 15 or 1600s, something like that. Still, more folks look at Roman coins and say that he looks a lot like the figures on those coins, so he's probably from the Roman era, but we really just don't know. Now, there's some weird stuff that goes on around the Long Man. There's pagan religions that have ceremonies and rituals around the base of him because they think he's something to do with their gods. I really don't know what that's about. Alright, so the Long Man's cool and all, but this makes him even cooler. I'll leave you with this folk story of Celtic origin. This story infers that he represents Lugus, who was one of the Celtic gods. 2 giant brothers lived on the hills of ancient Sussex. They were jealous and they were violent, and they always argued about who had more land and who was more powerful. One day, as they were both looking out over their lands, one cow roamed from one brother's land to the other. They began fighting over the cow, and the brother that took care of the Wilmington area, which is where the Long Man is, got beat up badly. His brother threw him up in the air as a finishing move, and he landed splat back on the hill, and he laid there dead. The Wilmington villagers were saddened because this man protected them. He looked over their land and protected their animals and everything like that. So they traced his outline where his body was laying into the grass, and it said that the Long Man of Wilmington still looks over the people of the area to this day. Now, that doesn't really tell us anything about the Celtic god Lugus, but it kind of ties back back to the fact that the people of the area probably originally outlined the long man and said that he represented Lugus, but then the folk story started about everything else. Stories like this will change perceptions of everything over the years, and there was a lot of years. Darius the Mede. Darius the Mede refers to a character from the book of Daniel in the Bible that reigned over the Babylonians between the times of Belshazzar and Cyrus the Great, or about the same time. Well, that's what some people say that the book of Daniel is said to be saying, but in all actuality, the actual verbiage that Daniel uses says that he was made king over the Chaldeans or the Babylonians, not that he actually reigned over the Medes and the Persians. This will be important later. This will put Darius as a subordinate king under Cyrus the Great, which is important whenever we're looking at the validity of the book of Daniel. Here's the thing, there is zero historical context that says that there was a king between the times of Belshazzar and Cyrus the Great. If we believe that Daniel was telling the truth, then this would place Darius as the king under Cyrus over part of the empire. If you want to know the truth about it, the book of Daniel is literally the only mention in all of history about this man named Darius the Mede. It does give a really detailed account of who he was as a person though. It says that he was the son of Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, you may know him as. Now this same Darius is the one that threw Daniel into the lion's den only for him to come out unscathed. Okay, so I've info dumped a lot here, but let's put together a cohesive thought about who this Darius guy was. So historians say that the book of Daniel was probably completely fictional because of this seeming error over the Darius the Mede character, but here's the counterpoints to that. First of all, after Cyrus the Great invaded and took over Babylon, he actually gave up leadership of the area to a man named Gubaru. This Gubaru ruled over the Babylonians, but he didn't rule over anything else. He was still under Cyrus the Great, as we were talking about earlier. That's what Darius the Mede was said to have done. It's entirely possible that Darius the Mede was just another name given to Gubaru. The name Darius actually translates to the royal one, so if you think about it, this could just be a title that was given to the person over the Babylonians. That's why Gubaru was known as Darius the Mede in the book of Daniel. Here's another option. Darius the Mede was just another title given to Cyrus the Great. This is the theory that I actually like the best. It kind of makes the most sense in my little brain. Darius the Mede was said to be 62 years old by Daniel whenever he conquered the Babylonians. Cyrus the Great was literally 62 when he conquered Babylon. Cyrus was also known as the king of the Medes, just like Darius. Supplemental texts of the Bible, like the Apocrypha, actually confirmed that Cyrus, not Darius, was the one who threw Daniel in the lion's den, so this would make perfect sense. I think that Darius the Mede was actually Cyrus the Great. Now, why Daniel referred to him as Darius the Mede, I really don't know. It was probably something to do with titles and politics of that time that we don't know anything about to this day. You gotta tell me what you think about this one down below in the comments, because I really don't know what to think about this. I don't know if Darius the Mede was Gubaru. I don't know if he was Cyrus the Great. Let me know what you think. Rongo. Remember those people that created over 1,000 Moai statues that have gone down in history to be the coolest thing since before sliced bread? The Easter Island heads are awesome, but these people actually created something else that's almost just as amazing. They created their very own writing system known as Rongo. This is a system of glyphs that contain human forms, animal forms, geometric shapes, and other stuff like that, but there's one problem with these things. We can't read them or decipher them at all. Also, on a side note here, these things date back to 1100 AD at the very earliest. They probably weren't created that long ago, but anyway, sliced bread wasn't invented until 1928, so I got you there. It literally was before sliced bread. Anyway, Rongo translates to recite, to declaim, and to chant out in the Rapa Nui language. Today, there's only 30 wooden tablets that remain that still have this script on them, so this explains why it's so hard for us to decipher these things. Legend has it that the legendary founders of the Rapa Nui civilization on Easter Island brought 67 wooden tablets with them from their homeland, and only 30 of them remain to this day for some reason. The problem with this is that the script was never found literally anywhere else, like Polynesia or South America, where these people were probably from. There's never any mention of these glyphs anywhere else. To make matters worse, literally everyone in the Rapa Nui civilization that was fluent in Rongo, by the time this thing was discovered by outsiders, was either dead or sold into slavery during the slaving raids that just destroyed the civilization. Here's the thing, Rongo was discovered in 1864 by a Frenchman named Eugene Irand. Back 100 years before that, the Spanish people annexed Easter Island and they forced the Rapa Nui people to sign and read their Spanish treaties. At this point, whenever they read and signed these treaties, there was literally no glyphs of Rongo at all. They didn't sign these things on these Spanish treaties. Now, thanks to radiocarbon dating, we can date back these wooden tablets. We can see when they came from, and it's very, very unlikely that any of them existed before the 1770 Spanish treaties were signed. So what does this mean? It's likely that the Rapa Nui leaders saw these Spanish words on the treaties, they saw the system of writing and everything like that. They decided they needed their own writing system, so they developed Rongo Rongo within this 100-year time span. This kind of thing has been done before, such as Sequoia's Cherokee alphabet that was created based on the English writing. It's highly unfortunate that Rongo Rongo died out within 100 years of its creation, but this is probably the most possible explanation of where it came from and how it happened. It's also highly unfortunate that literally nobody can decipher it, but it is what it is. The Black Sea Flood. The Black Sea Flood is a theory about the ancient floods that existed within basically all Mediterranean cultures of ancient times. Remember that guy Noah and his ark? Or maybe you remember Gilgamesh, or even the Hindu writings of the Great Flood. Well, this theory says that all of these events, all of these flood stories lead back to one event. 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, the last ice age ended and it flooded the Mediterranean Sea to the point that sea levels rose so high that they wiped out all of these ancient civilizations that were built in fertile crescents, fertile floodplains. As a result, all these people from these flooded lands fled their homelands and they spread the story of the Great Flood to everyone around there. Alright, so obviously Noah's flood story goes as follows. He receives instructions from God to build an ark. He builds the ark and he brings his whole family and 2 of every animal onto the ark. They wait a year and then they go back to land and restart civilization because everybody else in the world died. The Black Sea Flood theory says that the entire world did not flood, not everybody was wiped out, just the people in the Mediterranean, and just the people in the Mediterranean because the sea overflowed in the Bosporus Strait in Istanbul, Turkey. They said that it spilled over for at least 300 days and flooded 39,000 square miles. The 300 days of flooding would actually line up pretty well with Noah's story of flooding, but I'm not quite convinced yet. The counter argument to this theory is that there's no evidence, underwater or otherwise, that settlements in just this area were destroyed by the flood. Now, I won't tell y'all what to believe, that's up to y'all, but I do think that the whole earth, or at least the civilized parts of it, was flooded, and that was that. Every civilization was flooded and wiped out, and that's why we have no evidence of just the places in this area being wiped out. But like I said, I don't really know anything. I just talk about this stuff on the internet. These concepts are greater than my entire existence, so what do I really know? Vinca symbols. Vinca symbols are an ancient set of symbols inscribed on clay tablets between the years of 5300 BC and 3500 BC. Some were found near Vinca, which is an archaeological site in Serbia, but there were others found in other Slavic countries like Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. The Vinca culture was a Stone Age civilization that thrived in agriculture, and they eventually learned how to use copper, so that's pretty neat. Now, as for their symbols, historians actually disagree about whether or not these things actually made up a system of writing. Now, like so many of these other scripts we've already talked about, these things cannot be deciphered because we don't know what language or if any language they were based on, so it's likely they will never be deciphered. Some people think it wasn't writing at all, it was just completely symbolic. Now, there are 5,421 symbols in the script, and they seem to basically all be pictorial in nature. There are pictograms such as animals, the sun, swastikas and crosses, and many, many more. Now, since so many pieces of pottery were found with these symbols on it, it's said that these people probably used these symbols to mark property as their own. They say some of these were probably used in religious ceremonies or rituals or vows, stuff like that. This would explain why so many of these pieces of pottery were found in basically trash areas buried. Once they were done with their ritual or their ceremony or whatever it was, they just tossed it. Generally, the consensus is that the Vinca symbols are just that. They probably didn't make up a special writing system, and that's okay. They didn't need a special writing system back in those days. These symbols served as all they needed during their lifetimes. Ancient Greek zombies. Alright, so the ancient Greeks had several strange beliefs and fascinations that have carried over into the modern day, and zombies are one of those. The Greeks believed in undead creatures called vrikolakas that ate flesh and for some reason really liked the taste of human livers. The lore of these things are very much like vampires, but the fact that they eat flesh and stuff like that makes them kind of more of a zombie category. So how are these things made or whatever? Well, they're originally dead people that did one of these things in life. They either lived a sacrilegious life, they were excommunicated, they were buried in unholy ground, or they ate the meat of a sheep that had been wounded by a wolf or a werewolf. Now that last one is way too specific. I don't even know what was going on there. Now the Greeks were so serious about this stuff that if they suspected that somebody that died had indulged in one of these activities while they were alive, they would literally do all in their power to stop the reanimation of them. They literally placed heavy rocks in the graves of these dead people to keep them from rising up out of their graves. This is crazy. They would place coins and figurines and vases and stuff like that inside the graves for good measure, just for good omens. So what exactly did the Vrikolakas do besides just eat people? Well, they would leave their grave on every day but Saturday, which is gonna be important later. They would play Ding Dong Ditch and call out the names of the people that lived in these houses. And if the people in these houses answered on the first time they called out their name, the people would die, and later they would be reanimated as Vrikolakas themselves. They would also walk around, and since they're undead creatures, they were riddled with sickness, they would cause epidemics of sickness around the places they walked. Alright, so what was that thing about them not leaving their graves on Saturdays? Well, on Saturdays, they gotta get their beauty sleep. They're like the rest of the world. They'd stay in their graves to sleep. These Saturdays are the best time to exterminate them, which you absolutely want to do, because obviously the longer these things stay alive and eat flesh, then the stronger they're gonna get, right? So if you ever happen to come across a Vrikolaka, here's what you can do. While they're asleep, you can impale them, burn them in their grave, behead them, or do basically anything else to kill a normal person, because they're just normal people that reanimate. So that might be useful information for you if you're, an ancient Greek. Hermes Trismegistus. This refers to the ancient syncretic figure from ancient Greece in the Hellenistic period known as Hermes Trismegistus. Now, he was basically just a combination of the Greek messenger god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. Somewhere along the line, somebody decided that these two gods were equal, so they started being worshipped in the same temples. The combination of these two gods was referred to as Hermes Trismegistus, and he was said to have written the Hermetica, which you've probably definitely heard of that. Now, these writings became extremely popular, the Hermetica, you've definitely heard of this. Anyway, hard sciences and philosophy, this was what he wrote about. Now, the science part of this included medicine, astrology, alchemy, and even magic. So you can imagine how unhinged some of this stuff actually was. Now, the philosophy side of it is probably more famous, and it deals with anthropology, which is the study of human nature, cosmology, which is the study of the nature of the universe, and also theology, because every good person talks about religion, right? Now, I've heard of Hermeticism as related to philosophy and stuff like that forever, but I had no idea that it actually traced back to Hermes Trismegistus. I've never even heard of this guy. Now, obviously, all these writings come from different authors. It wasn't actually Hermes Trismegistus because this person was not real. It was kind of like a pseudonym for all these different people writing stuff. Now, I'd like to point out that this Hermes Trismegistus was originally studied and worshipped in Egypt whenever they decided that Hermes and Thoth were the same entity. Trismegistus actually translates from Greek into thrice greatest, and this originated due to an Egyptian epithet for Thoth that called him great, that is, the greatest. And Hermes comes from the name Hermes, obviously. I'll leave you with some knowledge straight from the Hermetic texts. The punishment of desire is the agony of unfulfillment. In my small brain, this means that the more you want something, the more it's gonna hurt until you get it. My dumb old redneck advice is this: if something that you desire is truly out of reach, let it go, because the hurt and the pain from desiring it is more than it's worth. But if something is feasibly attainable, use the pain that this desire creates within you to fuel yourself until you attain that thing. This is how great people achieve their goals, and this is kind of what I'm doing with this YouTube channel. I'm not calling myself a great person, but I really want to do this, so I'm trying to be more consistent with it. Apply that to yourself and your own scenario, and there you go, you're a natural hermeticist. Mithras and Mithraism. Mithras was the Roman evolution of the ancient Iranian god Mithra, who was a key figure in Zoroastrianism. Now, Mithra was the god of light in ancient Persia, but after Alexander the Great conquered all of Persia, their gods kind of translated themselves over into the Hellenistic period in their religions. As such, Mithra eventually evolved into Mithras in the Roman mythology, and he served as more of a god of mystery. Now, since he was identified with mystery, he obviously had an entire cult dedicated to the worship of him, because that's just how these things work, right? This worship of him eventually became known as Mithraism, and it was actually like a key rival to Christianity in the early days of Christianity. Now, the Romans also think of Mithras as a sun god, a god of war, and a god of justice. As such, he had quite the following, and a lot of those were actually soldiers, because god of war, god of justice, stuff like that. Members of the cult had certain rituals they followed, such as handshakes, underground temple meetings, code phrases, stuff like that, but they also had advanced rituals such as a bull slaying routine for some reason. Now, this ritual was actually to commemorate Mithras's own experience of slaying a bull, and it was to stimulate fertility for all the land. Legend has it that when Mithras was born, he had a torch and a knife. For some reason, he rode a cosmic bull that gave life to all vegetation across the universe, after he slayed it. Now, why he slayed it, I really don't know. Now, since these people believed that Mithras was real and this actually happened, they slayed their own bulls. They had rituals for this ceremony. Now, much like most cults and secret societies and stuff like that, these people actually had their own ranks within it, and it was called grades. That's how they were separated. They actually wore different masks during their meetings to show their different ranks and grades. And it was said that the higher rank or grade you got, the higher your soul got in heaven or in the stars, actually, after your death. I totally skipped over the whole underground temples thing earlier, but yeah, they had underground temples. They were called Mithraeum, and their sole purpose was for gathering places for these people to perform their rituals and killing bulls and stuff like that. Now, as I said, Mithraism was actually really popular among Roman soldiers and lower class individuals, but it actually drew some of the higher rank individuals as well. While it's not explicitly stated that these emperors were members of Mithraism, like of the actual society, the emperors Commodus, Septimus Severus, and Caracalla encouraged the religion heavily among the Roman soldiers. Mithras was the god of justice, and they wanted their soldiers to be firm in justice and serving the king, stuff like that, so they really did encourage it among them. So if it was so popular back in the day, what happened to it? Well, Christianity did. As Christianity began to gain steam, Mithraism began to die off. Christians denounced Mithraism as pagan rituals and stuff like that, so that really didn't help it at all either. When Emperor Constantine started winning battles under the cross, Mithraism basically died out. Mithra and later Mithras had a great run though. From ancient Persia all the way to the days of the Byzantine Empire was not too shabby. We're gonna start this thing off with the Plutonian at Hierapolis. Alright, so as we all know, the Roman god of the underworld was Pluto, so the Plutonian is a shrine to him. It's said that shrines like this serve as gates to the underworld, and with a little bit more context, this makes a lot of sense. The thing is, these Plutonian shrines are most of the time located in places that emit lots of toxic gases to everywhere around it, so like waves of death come across the wildlife and people around the area, and just, it's a bad deal. So that's what a Plutonian is, but we gotta ask the question, why is this one at Hierapolis so special? Well, to start with, Hierapolis is a Greek city built on a cult center and hot spring in like the Anatolia region of Turkey. This cult center that was what the city was built around was a cult of the Phrygian goddess Cybele, but in the Greek days it was actually taken over by the cult of Apollo. Now this first cult of Cybele recognized that this place was a gate to hell or whatever because there was a deadly cave underneath it. This cave was absolutely full of waves of carbon dioxide that were coming off of volcanic activity. Now priests of this cult would go down into the cave, they would hold their breath, and they would come back up and they would be just fine, and everybody thought they were holy because of that. Obviously, if you go down there and you don't breathe in the carbon dioxide, you're not gonna die. Like, nothing's gonna happen to you if you don't breathe in the toxic gas. In some cases, these priests would even take animals down there with them, and they would come back dragging their animals because the animals died because, you know, they breathe in the carbon dioxide. They don't know not to breathe. I guess it's kind of helped their credibility with the people around there at the time. They kind of proved their divinity or whatever you want to call it. It's kind of like just animal sacrifice to me, though. It's kind of cruel. Now, during the Roman days, this place functioned very similarly, but it actually became known as Pluto's Gate. Like I said, rituals of animal sacrifice to Pluto would go on down there, and in hindsight, that's just really sad. So while this gate to hell was pretty cool and all, it's actually kind of a danger to even be around. It's been said that groups of birds would fly over, and on particularly bad days where there's lots of carbon dioxide coming out of the cave, they would breathe it in and they would drop dead. Like, that's very sad. Now, during the Christian takeover of Rome, this place was actually sealed up because of pagan rituals, such and such, all that kind of stuff, and it was actually buried by an earthquake later on, so it actually wasn't unearthed until like pretty recently, actually, in the grand scheme of things. Now, I'm gonna guess that since this place was recently unearthed, that the carbon dioxide emissions are kind of controlled now, but honestly, if you ask me, some places are better off sealed up. The Antikythera mechanism. Known as the world's first analog computer, the Antikythera mechanism served ancient Greece as a predictor of astronomical events. Basically, it worked to predict where the sun, moon, and stars were on any given day, and when I say any given day, I mean any day, past, present, or future. The hand crank on this thing could be calibrated to where the celestial bodies were on that given day, and then you could set the thing to predict any other day based on where they are today. It was some seriously advanced astronomical technology for back in that day. Now, when I say back in that day, it originated in ancient Greece all the way back in like 200 to 60 BC, so like over 2,000 years ago. Despite being that old, the first pieces of it weren't found until 1901 in a shipwreck off the coast of Antikythera, Greece, which is where it gets its name. Now, it was originally over a foot tall, but it broke into like 82 small pieces over the years, being on the bottom of the seafloor and all. Now, while I say this thing was super advanced for the time, you gotta realize that the ancient Greeks were like super advanced in their astronomy. They were very, very ahead of their time. Thales of Miletus studied at both Babylon and Egypt, which were both very, very advanced in their society before Greece ever even was. As a result of all his studying, this guy successfully predicted a solar eclipse in the year 585 BC, and that paved the way for Cleostratus to thrive. This Cleostratus eventually introduced the zodiac to the world, and that was key in making the Antikythera mechanism work. So while this thing is technically thought of as a Greek device, it was actually more of a team effort to get it to function properly. Now, the 37 plus gears and the mechanical side of this device were definitely Greek, as were the zodiac planetary movement signs, but the Babylonians and Egyptians contributed some too. The Egyptians contributed their 365-day solar calendar, which allowed the device to track time. And since we mentioned time, this Antikythera device was actually used by the Greeks to track Olympiads, which are 4-year spans in which the Olympics would occur at the end of each. Anyway, the Babylonians set the foundation of math that was necessary to get this thing to track planetary movement and the eclipses and stuff like that. It really seems like the Antikythera mechanism was the culmination of generations worth of work from all the civilizations around the Hellenistic period, so this thing's really cool to me. The Lost Mine of Ophir. The Lost Mine of Ophir refers to a legendary gold mine that was owned or at least operated by King Solomon from the Bible. Now, Ophir was originally a name mentioned in the lineage of Shem, who was Noah's son, all the way back in Genesis 10. Later on in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles, it says that King Solomon and the Phoenician king of Tyre, Hiram, brought back abundances of gold from this legendary mine of Ophir. They would send ships, and ships would bring back tons of gold. There's even more mentions in the Bible of this thing whenever Isaiah and Job talk about the finest gold of Ophir. So this begs the question, where in the world is this legendary mine of Ophir? Now, it's pretty easy to say that the Lost Mine of Ophir was just a biblical storytelling mechanism, like they say Darius the Mede was back in the book of Daniel, but there was recently an ancient pottery shard found in Tel Aviv that seemingly confirms the existence of Ophir. Yet again, we can ask, where is this place? Since so many people ask the question, there's tons of answers out there. There's lots of theories as to where this could have been. People say that it could have been in Sri Lanka, India, the Philippines, even America, but the most common theory is that it was actually in Saudi Arabia. So there's a site in Saudi Arabia called Ma'ad ad-Dahab that they say could have held all this gold that they were talking about way back in the day. Biblical accounts say that Solomon brought back 34 tons of gold from Ophir at one point, which equals about $125 million worth of gold to this day. So, you know, that's a lot of gold. Some engineers have examined this Ma'ad ad-Dahab site, and they say that it actually could have held that much, so that's kind of crazy. This site is also well within the bounds of the ships of the day, like Solomon's people from Israel could have made it all the way there and back easily. The port of Aqaba opens up to the Red Sea, and it offers easy access to Saudi Arabia. That's actually a problem to some people who theorize about this, because it's too short of a distance to take as long as the trip was said to take. 2 Chronicles tells us that Solomon's ships would be gone for 3 years on their trips to Ophir and back. These theorists said that Saudi Arabia was too close for it to have taken that long. They could have actually had to mine all the gold once they got there, and that's what took 3 years, but I really don't know. That group of theorists I've been talking about thinks that Sri Lanka or India could actually line up better time-wise with what it would have taken, but you'll have to let me know what you think down below in the comments. Woodhenge. This refers to a timber monument that was built at about the same time and within 2 miles of, guess what? Guess what? Stonehenge. Now, while its big brother Stonehenge gets all the love and attention because the stones that they used back in the day were still there, this place was only found because of the post holes where the timber used to be. It had 168 post holes that were arranged in concentric ovals around the burial site of a child in the center. Now, this theory gets even more disturbing whenever you realize that this child very well could have been a child sacrifice because its skull was split and like splintered in its grave, but that's purely speculation. That's just a theory. Alright, so as I said, Woodhenge was built about the same time as Stonehenge, which was about 2500 BC, and the artifacts found at Woodhenge say that it was probably still in use until the year 1800 BC, so a good 700 years. Now, it was discovered in 1925 when the squad leader Gilbert Insall, who was from the British Royal Air Force, flew over a wheat field and saw these concentric ovals in the wheat field. I think he took pictures of them, and that's how they know it's there. This wheat field was then investigated, and they found the 168 post holes, and now the monument is there. Based on other Neolithic hinges and findings, it probably looked like this. Now, while nobody truly knows what it was used for, Woodhenge is like very underrated. I think it's almost as cool as Stonehenge if you ask me. The Anunnaki. The Anunnaki were a group of gods that the ancient Mesopotamians prayed to and invoked and all that kind of stuff. These people included the Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, Babylonians, and even in some form the Hittites, though the Hittites kind of thought they were lower on the totem pole than others. The most important of these gods was said to be Enlil, who served served as the god of air and atmosphere and stuff like that, but there were 6 other main gods that were definitely a part of this group. And I say that because we're going to see that there were a lot more that were considered possibly part of the Anunnaki. These 7 main gods stayed relevant through all the different ages of the ancient Mesopotamian cultures. During the Sumerian days, these Anunnaki served as more of what we would think of a god to be as today, kind of like the god of the heavens. Most of the following ages showed these Anunnaki to become the gods of the underworld instead of the creation gods, which is not bad, but you know, it's not all powerful like they were. Speaking of creation, the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, showed these gods in a totally different light. It says that the main Babylonian god Marduk commanded 300 Anunnaki to live on the earth and 300 more to live in the heavens. I don't care who you are, that's a lot of gods. Alright, so as we all know, the most famous piece of literature from the ancient Mesopotamian days was the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? Well, this story says that the Anunnaki served as the 7 great judges of the underworld. That's pretty similar to what I said earlier. All these further ages in the Mesopotamian days said that they served as gods of the underworld. Now that's it for the real stuff on them, but as with every group of ancient gods and deities, beings, stuff like that, there are conspiracy theories. Multiple people over the years have decided that the Anunnaki were actually, guess what? Say it with me. Aliens. One theorist says that the Anunnaki came to Earth over 500 years ago. They started the human race and used the human race as slaves for their mining operation. And as soon as the Great Flood hit, it destroyed their base of operations and they had to leave. Now, this might be one of the most unhinged theories I've ever heard, but you know, it kind of makes sense whenever you think about who's writing these theories. But anyway, my personal favorite theory is that the Anunnaki are actually the reptilian overlords that still rule over us to this day because, yep. Hyperborea. This was a mythical place to the far north of the entire known world, so far north that it was even higher than the northern winds. In Greek mythology, the god of the north wind was Boreas, so that kind of tells you where the name comes from. Hyperborea was said to be the home place of a super powerful race of Hyperboreans that lived for over 1,000 years apiece. They were the favorite people of Apollo, and as such, they helped start the oracle at Delphi and the worship at Delos. Now, obviously, the actual location of Hyperborea is not known to us because it may not have even been real. It was said to have been located in the Riffian Mountains where the north wind could not even reach it. Now the problem with this is we don't know if these Riffian Mountains are even real or if they were a name for another set of mountains, or we really don't know. Some people believe them to be the Alps, with the Celtic people of the region serving as the Hyperboreans. Some people say they were near the Black Sea, some say they were near the Danube River, and some people even say they were the Ural Mountains in Russia, but nobody knows for certain. Wherever it was said to be nearly impossible to reach Hyperborea. The peaks of the surrounding Riffian Mountains were guarded by griffins. The valleys were guarded by the Arimaspi tribe, which was one-eyed people that fought with griffins all the time. But anyway, the climate was also so bad, nobody could get there. About the only figures ever said to have reached Hyperborea for a visit were demigods like Hercules, Perseus, Theseus, and them, so you can kind of guess what the Greeks thought about visiting this place. Hyperborea was very similar to Atlantis in the fact that nobody actually went there. It was just a mythical place full of very, very special people. Newgrange. This is a prehistoric monument in Ireland that was said to have been built in about 3200 BC by the people that preceded the Celtic people in the Irish area. Basically, it's a massive tomb with a passage leading to it. The whole thing is comprised of megalithic stones that are up to 279 feet in diameter and up to 43 feet tall, so these things are massive. Now the passageway is 63 feet long and it opens up to 3 graves. These graves probably belong to like the village leaders or something like that, somebody important. Now the stones are engraved with lots of markings of like patterns and stuff that might represent the sun and moon. That's what they interpret it to be, but we don't really know for a fact, you know. Inside the graves were burned and unburned human bones, as well as stuff that served as like grave goods, artifacts, stuff like that. Back to the sun and moon, the entrance to Newgrave has a roof box that allows the sun to shine into the passage for 17 minutes at dawn on the winter solstice. So despite being created all the way back in 3200 BC, which is before Stonehenge and Woodhenge and all of that, these people still knew a lot about astronomy. They must have known a lot about transport too, because if you remember those mega stones I said make up most of the passage, there were 35 of those things. I don't think 35 of them would just originally get there. I think they probably had to move them. Anyway, in Irish mythology, this place represented a portal to the other world, which was basically their heaven. An Irish folktale says that Newgrange and the surrounding monuments belonged to their god Angus, who stole them from his father using trickery. Long story short, Angus told his father, who was the chief god, Dagda, that he wanted to own this place for night and day. His father agrees to this, obviously thinking that it would just be like one night and one day, but Angus says that this place now belongs to him forever because every day is composed of night and day. So there's that. Newgrange is super cool, and I could go on for a long time about it if I really wanted to, but honestly, you should just go see it. You can book tours to there right now. Roman dodecahedron. A Roman dodecahedron looks like this, and it's made of copper alloy with no inscriptions, no anything like that, just some cutouts in the middle. As the name implies, it's just a dodecahedron with little metal balls on each vertex. These things date back to the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries AD, but the fact of the matter is nobody knows what these were used for. That we are literally clueless. They've been found literally all over Europe except in the mainland of Rome and Italy, which kind of makes no sense at all, but whenever you think about it, these things are actually called the Gallic Roman dodecahedrons, so that does make sense. We'll talk some more about the Gauls here in a little bit. I'm excited. The thing is, there's no standard size for these things. They range from like 4 centimeters all the way up to 11 centimeters, and from weighing 35 grams all the way up to 1,000 grams. This means that the theory that they were probably used for measuring devices is totally out the window. Because of the insane tediousness that it takes to make these things, it's concluded that they were probably used in something important to society. Some people theorize that they might have been used in like religious rituals, but my favorite theory is that they were actually used for magic. Let me explain. So they were not found in mainland Rome. They were found in the Gallic regions, which is where the Gauls were. So they were probably made by the Gauls. Now the Gauls believed in magic big time. Like they had spirits, they had druids that ruled over them, and they just practiced a lot of magical rituals. Couple this with the fact that the Roman Empire would eventually outlaw magical practices because of its turn to Christianity, and we've got a really good explanation as to why nobody knows what these things were used for. They were used for magic, and anything that was written down about the magical rituals had to be disposed of either by the Christian Romans or by the Gauls who didn't want to get caught by the Christian Romans. This magic would remain a secret to the end of time. But I don't know, they could have just been used as expensive dice for the rich people in Roman and Gallic society, but let me know what you think. I don't know. The Bent Pyramid of Sneferu. This refers to a pyramid built in roughly 2600 BC by the Egyptian pharaoh Sneferu. The unique thing about this pyramid is that it started out being built at about a 54-degree angle, but at like 154 feet up, they decided to change it to a 43-degree angle. This change in the middle of the construction of the pyramid makes it look like the pyramid is bent, like you can see here on the screen. It's actually really cool and unique looking if you ask me, but you know, I'm not very important. Another difference is that this pyramid is actually built with smooth sides, unlike the step pyramid of before. The step-sided pyramid that Imhotep built before was at an angle of close to 54 degrees, so it's likely that Sneferu's engineers just try to replicate this, but in a smooth-sided pyramid. This 54-degree angle did not work, as they found out about 154 feet up, so they had to change the angle. They changed the angle to 43 degrees, and while it looks kind of funny, it makes it really unique. And they discovered for future reference that the 43-degree angle does work for a smooth-sided pyramid, so it's a win-win. Not long after this discovery, Sneferu commissions the Red Pyramid to be built at a 43-degree angle, where it still stands today. Now, I've told you all this stuff that actually makes sense, but what if that was just like justifications for what actually happened? What if aliens came down to Egypt and taught them how to build the pyramids to harness the energy of the universe, and they use it to power their spaceships and leave? Yep. That's it. The mystery of the Pleiades across ancient civilizations. The Pleiades are a star cluster in the night sky whose movements were tracked by ancient civilizations all across the globe. The movements of the cluster have important meanings for these people, but for now, let's just talk about lore. The Pleiades were almost always referred to as 7 sisters or 7 women in general. The thing is, only 6 stars are visible to this day, but once upon a time, 7 actually were visible to the naked eye. The problem with this is that it would have been over 100,000 years ago when this was the case, at least according to one theory. Now, this theory relies on evolution and the migration of humans, so take that how you will, but it says that all these people must have been still in the home continent of Africa before they migrated out whenever the 7 stars were up in the sky. 50,000 years later, whenever the migration of humans started, they carried these stories and this folktale to everywhere they went. That's why all these different cultures still talk about 7 women representing the Pleiades. Anyway, the Greek interpretation of the Pleiades is probably the most popular on the list. It says that they're the 7 daughters of the Titan Atlas and the Oceanid Pleione. As Atlas was forced to hold up the weight of the heavens on his shoulders, the hunter Orion started chasing his daughters, the Pleiades. To comfort Atlas, Zeus made the Pleiades into stars, but he also made Orion into a star constellation, so it looks like the constellation of Orion is still chasing the Pleiades to this day. Similar stories like this exist across different cultures and different peoples, even among like Jewish people and Native Americans, which are 2 groups you really wouldn't think to be intertwined with Greek mythology. And I guess they're really not intertwined with Greek mythology, it's just stars and astronomy, which that's everywhere. If you can name a people, they have at least a little bit of folklore about the 7 sisters, or at least 7 women. So this lends credit to the theory that they were all together at one time on Africa before they migrated out. Now, I personally don't believe in the entirety of the evolution and migration theory, but I do believe that people were together at one point. You know, the Tower of Babel did happen in the Bible, so you got that. That could have been when it happened. Now, as for how the star cluster was used by these different people, it most of the time went something like this. As the Pleiades fell with the sunset, it meant one thing, and as the Pleiades rose with the sunrise, it meant something different, normally the opposite. For the Berber tribe of Africa, it meant that hot summer was approaching and cold winter was approaching, respectively. So like most celestial bodies and astronomical figures, these Pleiades meant something to these ancient civilizations that had rudimentary skill with astronomy. Let's kick this thing off with Ain-Dara's footprints. Ain-Dara's footprints refers to a set of 4 giant footsteps at the entrance of the Ain-Dara temple in Syria. The footprints measure about 3 feet in length and 30 foot apart in stride, so you know what everybody's thinking, right? Giants. Based on that foot size and stride, it's estimated that whatever made these footprints were 65 feet tall, so yeah, a giant. Okay, so for a little bit of background, the Ain-Dara temple was built in about 1300 BC, which is even before Solomon's very first temple. It was built by the ancient Hittites out of limestone and basalt blocks, and it had tons of figures carved into each stone. It had geometric shapes carved into it, it had lines and sphinxes, and it even had some fully carved animals out of these blocks. Now, this temple was probably dedicated to the worship of the goddess Ishtar, but it could have been dedicated to the storm god Baal Hadad. Anyway, the footprints at the entrance to the temple were actually carved into the temple, so they weren't actual like molded footprints, but they were obviously inspired by something. I'm really sad that it's not like an ancient god or an ancient actual giant that stepped there and made the imprint in that stone forever, but nonetheless, it's still cool. What it does do is give credence to the idea that these ancient Hittites actually saw giants, so that's what inspired them to carve giant footprints that were like proportionally accurate. Dogu is the name of a group of clay figurines that were carved in ancient Japan that seemingly symbolize pregnant women. Now, they were made exclusively during the Jomon period of Japan, which took place from 14,000 BC all the way up to 400 BC, so that really doesn't help much. Now, the designs of all these dogu are very different from each other, but you can see over the years they become more and more human-like. And you can definitely track it over the years because there's a massive sample size to pull from. There were like 15 to 20,000 of these things uncovered in Japan. Now, there are basically 4 styles that have been found: heart-shaped, horned owl type, goggle-eyed, and the pregnant women type. So not all of these represent pregnant women like I said, but a lot of them do. Now, this pregnant type was actually said to be present in like labor, like in childbirth. It was symbolically aided in childbirth, apparently. I don't know how that works, but anyway, it was kept around the rest of the time to symbolize fertility. This makes a little more sense than you would originally think. Now, here's a fun fact for you. Most of these dogu are found broken, and it looks like they were intentionally broken, like somebody took them and just snapped them. Speculators think they might have been used as something similar to a voodoo doll. The dogu was created in the likeness of a person, and their illnesses were transferred over to that doll. The creator of the dogu snapped it in half, broke it, whatever, so they could banish their illness or whatever that was plaguing them. Now, this theory doesn't really fit with the pregnant women type, because if you snap a pregnant woman figurine, you're gonna, well, you know what's gonna happen. Anyway, another theory is that they were used in religious rituals. They would have been like mini idols that the people worshiped during their rituals, but yet again, I'm not really sure how that ritual of breaking them fits into that. The Nebra sky disk is a bronze disc inlaid with gold that represents a map of the stars. It's actually a huge debate as to whether it was created during the Bronze Age or the Iron Age, but it's a really cool representation of the cosmos either way. It has a bronze base that's about 12 inches in diameter, and its gold on it represents either the sun or the full moon, the crescent moon, and a bunch of stars. There's even a group of 7 stars that probably represent the Pleiades, and Lord knows we've talked about the Pleiades plenty on this channel. Now, besides the celestial bodies represented on the sphere, there's also golden arcs on either side of the bronze base, and also one on the bottom. The bottom arc is highly debated because nobody really knows if it's like a solar boat, if it's a rainbow, if it's a sickle. People really don't know. There's no consensus on this, and that's pretty much been the story of it since its discovery. And this discovery in itself is a whole story. In 1999, 2 guys were illegally searching a hillside in Germany, and they found it with metal detectors. They bent it up and basically totally wrecked the thing whenever they were digging it up, but they eventually sold it with a bunch of different artifacts artifacts that they dug up for a bunch of money on the black market. Since they found this stuff when they were digging on a hill in Nebra, Germany, and it was public land that's actually belonged to the German government. All these artifacts they dug up was German state property. But these people didn't want to give it to the German state. They wanted their money, so they sold it on the black market. It sold a few more times on this same black market until the German police ran a sting operation to gather all these artifacts up. This wasn't until 3 years later in 2002, whenever the Germans decided they wanted to get their stuff back for some reason, but anyway, the Nebra sky disc is in good hands now. Silphium was a plant native to the Cyrene region in North Africa that had more uses than pretty much any plant ever. It became the entire backbone of that region's economy because of its great versatility and the demand for it. Now this demand was like Greek and Roman centered. They really loved this thing. It was used as a forage for goats and sheep. Its stems were roasted and eaten by humans. Its roots were eaten with vinegar by humans. It had medicinal uses, and its sap was the most popular condiment in the entire Hellenistic world. It was used to treat sore throats, fevers, warts, stomach aches, hernias. I mean, literally everything. How does a hernia in the same category as a sore throat as far as medicine goes? I don't know, but anyway, this stuff was like a miracle plant. Somehow it was even used as a contraceptive and as a perfume, and now that's just weird. This plant was basically the greatest thing ever until humans had to go and ruin it, because of course we did. The thing is, Silphium only grew in the Cyrene region of Africa. Literally a 125 by 35 mile strip of land is the only place on the planet they could get it to grow normally. No matter what the Greeks and Romans tried, they could not figure out how to farm it, and they were pretty good at farming. As a matter of fact, the Africans couldn't even farm it. They had to let it grow as a weed and then harvest it like that. They couldn't even make it grow in a farm. As you might imagine, this over-harvesting of a wild plant did not end well for the wild plant. Within only 100 years of its discovery, Silphium went all but extinct. To this day, no Silphium can be positively identified. The closest visual representation we have is the giant fennel, but it's not likely that it was actually the same plant because it's just not the same. The most likely explanation as to what Silphium actually was is a hybrid between two plants. And if it was a hybrid between two plants, then the first generation of the cross between the plants would not be the same as the second generation. This would explain why it couldn't be farmed. So far as genetics go, the first generation cross between two different plants has what's known as hybrid vigor. This normally means that it has the best characteristics of both plants. It's very desirable. It has very good hardiness. It's going to survive. But the second generation, which is a cross between two of the first generation hybrids, is not the same at all. Genetics get weird, and these second generation crosses are totally different. Like I said, this would explain why Silphium couldn't be farmed. The seed plants that they tried to farm with grew up as second generation crosses, which are, not desirable. They're not the same as the first gen hybrid vigor crosses. Sorry about the rant. I kind of like genetics. I have a bachelor's in agriculture, so that's one of my hyperfixations. But anyway, let's go to the next one. The stone spheres of Costa Rica are a collection of over 300 man-made stone spheres that were sculpted by the people of the Dequis culture from the Costa Rica area. They were made in roughly 500 to 1500 AD, and they range in size from handheld all the way to 6 foot in diameter. They were mostly formed from igneous rocks of the area using stone tools of that time. The most common theory as to why they were placed where they were placed is that they were placed in lines leading up to the village leaders' homes. Another theory as to why they were created and what they symbolize is that they symbolize the center of the universe and the creation of the universe as the Dequis people saw it, but the exact meaning behind these things will probably never be known. Funny story, these things were actually found by workers clearing the rainforest for use as a banana plantation. They literally just pushed them out of the way with their bulldozers, which destroyed no telling how many of them. They made it worse by circulating rumors that there was gold in the middle of these stones. So what do you think blue collar workers are going to do? Blue collar workers are going to take a pickaxe and dynamite, and they're going to get to the center of those stones to find that gold. And I can hate on blue collar guys because I am one, so... Back to the banana plantations, I highly suggest you watch Wendigoon's video covering the banana farms of South America. It will literally show you that these people are evil. But that's pretty much it for the stone spheres. Tutankhamun's iron dagger refers to a special dagger that was found in King Tut's tomb that contained such a high concentration of nickel that people thought that it was probably smelted from meteoric material. It contained mostly iron as is usual, but it contained 11% nickel and 0.6% cobalt. This puts its composition well within the range of every meteorite found ever. Alright, so King Tut was mummified in 1323 BC, but the smelting of iron wasn't really discovered until 1200 BC. This would put the dagger in a really weird position. If it was created in Egypt, then it was probably cold cut from the meteorite material and then just polished up, because the smelting of iron in Egypt doesn't have records of actually happening until 600 BC. So somebody probably just cut this metal out of a meteorite and then just shined it up, made a dagger for him, right? Well, maybe not. There's another theory out there. Scholars say that this thing was never heated to the point of smelting, so we got that part right, but it's also said that it wasn't just strictly cold cut either. They say that it was heated lightly so it could be formed, and it was also inlaid with gold and lapis lazuli and other stuff to make it look pretty. Then the dagger was probably gifted to King Tut's grandfather by the king of Mitanni, because ancient Egyptian records show that this guy gave this other guy this dagger as a wedding gift. It's some pretty cool lore, but it wasn't like there was actually smelting before the time of smelting. What were the Vimanas? Vimanas are often thought of as mysterious flying chariots, floating cities, or even celestial aircraft. These were common entities in Hindu and Sanskrit texts that were said to be able to travel in space, fly in the sky, and even navigate through water. Many of these depictions, no matter whether it was like a car or a house or a chariot or what it was depicted to be 7 stories high for some reason. Here are a couple examples from Hindu stories. Ravana was a king and a brother to a god, and he had a flying chariot Vimana. A crystalline chariot that wandered the skies and the stars was owned by somebody named Vasu. I thought I was going to find more examples of these, and I probably would have if I would have been more ingrained in that culture, but anyway, the question remains, what really were these things if they were real? Well, to be honest, they probably weren't real, but if they were one of 2 things. Number 1, either ancient India had advanced aerial technology that was completely lost to time nowadays, or number 2 is my favorite. Aliens visited ancient India and they inspired all of these stories, as well as the rudimentary blueprints for flying machines that the Indians had, because these things are actually very close to what we have today as aircraft. I don't know. Sounds very possible. Baghdad battery refers to a battery device that was found southeast of Baghdad, Iraq, and it was probably created between the years of 150 BC and 650 AD. The battery was composed of a ceramic pot, a copper tube, and an iron rod. Now when this thing is assembled, which means that the copper tube is inside the ceramic pot and the iron rod is through the copper tube, and an electrolytic solution fills the rest of the pot, it will create about 1.1 volt of electricity. Now while it's not confirmed that this thing was actually used as a battery, it probably was because it works perfectly. The ancient Iraqis used a method called electroplating to stick sheets of metal together, such as like gold to silver, and it used electricity, obviously. It was electroplating. This would have been perfect for this. They could have also used small amounts of electricity in something called electrotherapy to, help pain and stuff like that, and this thing would have worked really well for that as well. It's low voltage, which is what you need. The sad part about this is that it completely disappeared off the face of the earth in 2003 during the USA's invasion of Iraq. So further testing on this thing will have to be done on models, so we'll never actually recreate the original thing. We'll never really know if it was actually used as a battery or if it was just a coincidence that using an electrolytic solution it could produce electricity. The Joseph Smith papyri was a collection of Egyptian funerary papyri that was sold to Joseph Smith in Ohio, of all places. He claimed that these 2 Egyptian texts were the Book of Abraham and the Book of Joseph, and he worked for a long time to translate the Book of Abraham. He worked on the Book of Joseph as well, but he never finished it. Here's the thing, he claimed that this Book of Abraham that he translated was an inspired writing that detailed the life of the biblical figure Abraham. If you don't know what an inspired writing is, it's basically when God works through you to write something, like the Gospels. Well, as it turns out, this Book of Abraham translates to the Hor Book of Breathing, which detailed the Egyptian funerary breathing rites. I don't know, it's not at all biblical. It was actually the navigation of the afterlife in Egypt, which anyway, that's still not the same at all. It had absolutely nothing to do with Christianity, and the same goes for the Book of Joseph. The Book of Joseph was a funerary scroll written for an Egyptian woman. Basically, everything Joseph Smith said about these books was a complete and total lie. It was likely that he lied about this stuff being inspired writing so that he could advance his Latter-day Saints church. Makes you wonder what else he lied about. As to where the papyri are today, they both ended up in the museum in Chicago after Joseph's death. The Great Chicago Fire ended up destroying almost everything in that museum, but there are fragments of these scrolls left. Since we can actually translate Egyptian, we can read these fragments now and say that everything he said about at least these scripts were a complete and total lie. The Olmec colossal heads are a group of 17 giant heads that were carved in Mexico that were probably from the Olmec civilization. The heads are anywhere from 4 to 11 feet tall and up to 25 tons in weight. They're basically just big stones with humanoid faces carved in them. They have very flat noses, puffy cheeks, and headdresses with like unique emblems carved into them. It's been theorized that these stones were the carved heads of the leaders of the Olmec people, and that would make sense as to why there's not not that many of them, and they're all unique in their emblems. Well, I don't know about you, but I previously knew absolutely nothing about the Olmec people, so here's a little bit about them. They were supposedly one of the original ancient civilizations, kind of like the Indus Valley civilization and the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians and those kind. It developed in Mesoamerica, which was like the southern part of Mexico and Central America. This was basically the rainforest, so it was a totally different type of civilization from the Mesopotamians. Of the 17 heads that were found, 10 of them were found in San Lorenzo and 4 of them were found in La Venta, and both of these cities served as like the cultural hubs for the Olmec people. Now I'm a little bit wrong. The Olmec people lived from like 1200 BC to 400 BC, so they weren't nearly as ancient as like the Egyptians and Mesopotamians, but they were some of the earliest people in that area. These heads were thought to have been carved in the early days of the Olmec people, because by about 900 BC, these things were all buried seemingly. To be honest, not that much is known about the Olmec people, and I've already told you basically everything we know about the colossal heads. So I guess it's just one of those ancient mysteries for a reason. The Lost Labyrinth of Egypt is a buried complex under the Hawara Pyramid in Egypt. It's said that it held tons of structures that would have told us a lot about ancient Egyptian culture. It was said to have libraries, galleries, temples, funerary complexes, and pretty much anything you can think of, because it had over 3,000 rooms. Herodotus said that this thing was an actual labyrinth, and that means a lot coming from him because he actually traveled to Egypt and saw it. Apparently there was about 300,000 square feet of labyrinth. If you're not good at relating things in size, that's insane. A decent sized house is about 2,000 square feet, so if you put 1,500 houses together, then you're gonna have the labyrinth. That's insane. Anyway, this thing was built in roughly 1800 BC by Amenemhat III and later expanded on by his daughter Soben-Neferu. Multiple Greek and Roman scholars say that this thing was magnificent and it was a wonder in itself. It was as great and magnificent as the pyramids. One guy goes as far as to say that this labyrinth is what inspired Daedalus to create the labyrinth for King Minos. If you don't know what that one was, it was the Crete labyrinth that had the Minotaur in it. Now that labyrinth is probably all just a story, but this thing had so much impact that it actually created, labyrinth stories like that. That's crazy. The Tollen Man and other bog bodies refers to a man found mummified in a peat bog in Denmark that was preserved so well that we know what he had to eat last. The man's body was found in 1950, but it's estimated that he actually died in 400 BC. Get this, the acidic and oxygen-free environment of the peat bog preserved this man's body so well that the people that found him thought he was a recent murder victim. In all actuality, he died 2,500 years ago. Now that's crazy. Anyway, his cause of death was said to be by hanging, and while he definitely could have just been executed for his crimes or whatever, he had a peaceful expression on his face. This peaceful expression leads a lot of people to believe that he was actually sacrificed as part of some ritual that they had going on. The last thing in his stomach was a porridge consisting of barley, flax, some seeds, and fish. So he was eating good. Now as for the other bog bodies part of this deal, there were over 500 bog bodies found in similar peat bogs across Europe. These other bodies found date back all the way to 8,000 BC, all the way up to like World War II as their time of death. Each bog varies in its acidity, its oxygen level, and its temperature, so literally every body that was found is at a varying degree of decomposition. Lots of these bodies are like the Tollen Man in that they were probably sacrificed instead of just executed for their crimes. Like I said, the oldest bog body found dates all the way back to 8,000 BC, and he probably died at about 20 years old. I'll leave you with this one, the Lindau Man. He was found in the Lindau Moss Peat Bog in England, and it's said that he probably died in the 1st century AD. His cause of death was said to be inconclusive because he had 3 possible causes of death. He had a bashed in skull, a slit throat, and strangulation marks on his neck. This poor man had it rough. The mystery of the Varna gold. This refers to 13 pounds of gold in various forms like beads and golden bulls and necklaces, stuff like that was found in the Varna necropolis in Bulgaria. The Varna culture dates back to 4600 BC all the way to 4200 BC, which is still 3,000 years before the Olmec civilization we just talked about. The gold dates back to every bit as old as the civilization, so that's seriously impressive. This means that the Varna people were molding gold into these figures all the way back in 4600 BC, which is before any other civilization ever. Alright, so far as the necropolis goes, it had 312 graves, and one giant thing stood out to researchers. Basically every grave had a flint knife or a bone bracelet or maybe even a bead of gold, but very few had large pieces of gold. Just 4 of the 312 graves found contain 3/4 of all the gold found in the entire Varna necropolis. Obviously, this points to them being the leaders or the most wealthy people in the Varna culture. This has proven that these people were pretty much the first in all of history to have a complex society with different levels of wealth and status. It's likely that these people that had gold were the first people that learned how to work with metal so they could form gold into whatever they needed it to be. Obviously, metal couldn't break, and if it did, you needed a metal worker to form it back into a tool or whatever you were using it for. So that's why metal workers were probably on top. Anyway, the Varna gold tells us a lot about ancient civilizations, even if it was 6,500 years ago. Where did the Sumerians come from? Alright, so the Sumerians were the OG settlers of ancient Mesopotamia, obviously settling between the Tigris and the Euphrates. They first settled here anywhere from the years like 5500 BC to 4500 BC, but the question remains, where did they come from to settle here? Well, the earliest known settlers of the area were the Ubaid people. They had towns, pottery, cattle farms, basically just a full functioning society. It's theorized that these people simply started nearby and then they migrated a little bit over to where the Sumerians really thrived, and they just morphed into what the Sumerians were known as whenever they were in full force. Another prominent theory is that the Sumerians actually came from North Africa and they settled in the Mesopotamian area because of its fertility. This theory gets heavily criticized because it's basically based on the assumption that farming actually originated in North Africa, which challenges the narrative that farming actually originated in Mesopotamia itself. Another theory says that Dilmun is the home city of the Sumerians. Dilmun is mentioned often in ancient Sumerian texts, saying that it actually was their homeland and it was located on the island of Bahrain. This is actually a valid theory because there's proof that there was a civilization there at one time, but it's unknown whether or not that was the Sumerians' home base. The last thing I'll say is this: the Sumerian language is a completely isolated language, meaning that there's no languages that relate to it before or after the Sumerian language itself. If we had literally any other languages to link to the Sumerians, we could find out more about these people, but as it stands, we just really don't know. My best guess is that they did come from the Ubaid people, but let me know what you think down below. The Karnak stones are a group of over 3,000 prehistoric stones that are arranged in rows over a kilometer long. Now in freedom units, that's like 3,800 feet or about 3/4 of a mile. At the ends of the rows of these things are circular patterns of stones. They're located near Brittany, France, and they range in their date from 4,500 BC to about 3,300 BC. If you remember, Stonehenge was created around 3000 BC, so these people were ahead of the curve. Now, these people were probably the pre-Celtic people of the area that were hunter-gatherers, unlike the agrarian society that built Stonehenge. Now, these stones range in height from about 13 feet tall all the way down to like 2 feet tall, and they were arranged in their rows from shortest to tallest or vice versa. Aside from the stone rows, we also have these circular patterns of stones that we already talked about, and we also have tumuli, which are burial mounds over graves. There are also dolmens, which is like 2 or more stones standing with a stone on the top of it that are over a grave as well. So what is actually the purpose of this random huge array of stones? Well, to be completely honest, I don't know. Most people think they probably have something to do with ancient astronomy. They might have been used to track the sun, moon, stars, solstices, and so on and so forth. They might have been used as rudimentary calendars to predict like the day of the year because of the stars and sun and stuff like that. I don't know. It probably is some sort of astronomical arrangement that these ancient people had figured out, but there's another theory that I actually like more. One day, a legion of Roman soldiers was marching through this field, and the wizard Merlin turned them to stone. It makes sense. Kofun refers to tumuli, which we literally just defined as burial mounds from the Kofun period in Japan. This period was from roughly 3rd century to 7th century AD. Now they do vary in size, but a lot of the time they are giant burial mound arrangements, sometimes spanning like hundreds of meters across and with moats surrounding them. So you know they were for the elites of society. Now there are several different shapes of these Kofun, from like square to circular to conjoined rectangle, but there's one that's even more popular. That title belongs to the keyhole-shaped Kofun. These are ridiculously cool looking and impressive works of art. Now the tombs themselves were most of the time nothing special. They had a coffin and they had grave goods. But from the grave goods we can actually tell how wealthy a lot of these people were. Iron weapons, bronze mirrors, fancy jade jewelry, and a whole bunch of other stuff tells us that some of these people really were wealthy. There was also a special type of pottery among the grave goods known as haniwa. This was typically a cylindrical amount of clay that was cut into like houses, animals, different figures, geometric amalgamations, different stuff like that. Rupkund is a mysterious lake at the high altitude of 16,470 feet in the Indian Himalayas. Now, Rupkund is also known as Skeleton Lake because when the snow melts every year, there are over 200 human skeletons found at the base of the lake. They were originally found in 1942 by a park ranger, and you remember what big, huge world event was going on in 1942, right? That's right. World War II. When they were found, the British authorities that still ruled India thought that it might be a Japanese invasion force that tried to get in through the Himalayan mountains, and that would have caused a massive panic. As it turns out, these skeletons were actually from 800 AD all the way up to 1800 AD, but they were not new enough to be a Japanese invasion force. Now, there seem to be two distinct groups of people that met their end by the lake. 800 AD and 1800 AD are 1,000 years apart after all. One group appeared to be pilgrims, men, women, and children that met their end at the lake because of a giant hailstorm that passed overhead. There's no cover by the lake, so the heavy hail bashed them in the head to death. It must have been an awful hailstorm. Hopefully it was a hailstorm, because if it wasn't, it was probably some sort of group sacrifice, kind of like Jonestown, so hopefully it was a hailstorm. These days Rupkund is a very popular tourist attraction, hikers and such, so hopefully no new groups of dead skeletons show up anytime soon. The Civitherium of Kish is an ancient giraffe-like extinct species that shows up on a copper rain ring from the city-state Kish, which was from Sumeria. Alright, so first off, the Civitherium was an ancient giraffe-like creature that roamed the continents of Eurasia and Africa in prehistoric times. It was about 10 feet tall at its head, so it was a lot shorter than a giraffe, but it was super beefy. It weighed about 3,000 pounds. For reference, there's a large breed of cattle known as Brahmins, and at full size, Brahmin bulls grow to only 2,400 pounds. So that's insane to be 3,000 pounds. This was basically a really tall bovine species that was spotted up like a giraffe with antlers like a moose. Honestly, it's one of the coolest things I've ever heard of in my entire life. Anyway, they supposedly died out about 1,000,000 years ago, but if the ancient Sumerians knew enough about them to draw them and to mold them into a copper rain ring, then that says that's probably not true. Turns out there's also cave paintings in the Sahara Desert and in India of Civitheriums that accurately depict them as soon as 8,000 years ago. Just based on these drawings, the Sumerians could have enough knowledge to draw these things out, but probably not enough to get so accurate with their little rain ring. One theory says that these things probably existed alongside Sumerians, and they used them as basically oxen to pull their chariots and wagons and stuff. Another theory says that these things still exist to this day, but they live in such isolated groups that nobody has seen them since the Sumerian days. I absolutely love these things now because they're just so cool. They basically become a modern day cryptid because nobody's seen them in so long, but still, these things are awesome. What is actually inside Qin Shi Huang's tomb? Qin Shi Huang was the first emperor of China, and he reigned from about 259 BC to 210 BC. He had a mausoleum or tomb built under a pyramid-shaped burial mound in the city of Xi'an. This mausoleum was said to have taken 38 years to build, so it's just a massive work of art. It is apparently 22 square miles of underground burial complex, which is absolutely insane to think about. Thing is, it still hasn't been excavated to this day. What we do know is that there's a collection of life-size terracotta figures known as the Terracotta Army that were found guarding the main mausoleum. Oh yeah, did I mention there's 8,000 of these things? Like everything else about this mausoleum, this is insane. The discovery of these figures is partially why the rest of the mausoleum has not been excavated yet. Within just 4 minutes of exposure to the outside area, the paint on these terracotta figures begins to dry out and flake off. Serious measures will have to be taken to excavate the rest of the tomb because we don't want to tear anything up. Anyway, what else might be in there? Well, the Chinese historian Sima Qian says that there are streams and pools of flowing mercury, there are precious metals and gold, stones, trees of jade, birds of gold and steel, literally anything you can think of, it's probably in there. It's basically described as being as close to heaven as they knew of back in that day. Flowing rivers of mercury would be super cool, except for the fact that this emperor probably died because of his consumption of mercury. Now, why was he consuming mercury? Well, the ancient Chinese thought that mercury was a life-giving elixir, so he was taking a little bit of it here and there, and it led to mercury poisoning. And that's probably what killed him. Anyway, give me some speculation. Let me know what you think might be in that tomb down below. What was the Set animal? The Set animal was an animal depicted either with or as the Egyptian god Set in hieroglyphs. Usual depictions show this animal as some type of canine. It looked like it could be a greyhound, fox, jackal, or something completely different. We really don't know. Some people think it could even be an aardvark because of its long curved snout. Some people think that it could be an antelope, which I really don't think could be possible. I don't think it's an antelope, but anyway, the most likely explanation is that it was either an amalgamation of a bunch of different of these animals, or it was an extinct animal that we don't even know of. The only other explanation that I think could be possible is that it was a saluki, or a Persian hound. This dog looks nearly identical to the hieroglyph of the Set animal, so I think it really could be possible. We know that the Egyptians knew of the saluki because the saluki was represented in other hieroglyphs. So honestly, aside from an amalgamation or extinct animal that we don't know about, the saluki is probably the most likely explanation to what the Set animal really was. Let's kick it off with Adam's Bridge. This is a 30-mile long chain of limestone shoals between the Indian Pamban Island and the Sri Lankan Mannar Island. Some of the shoals are slightly out of the water, while most of them are actually submerged in it. This, along with some legends from the area, say that there was once a strip of land here that was actually above water and formed an actual bridge between mainland Sri Lanka and mainland India. So where exactly does the name Adam's Bridge come from? Well, here's the story. In the Islamic faith, Adam, who was the first man ever created, fell from grace whenever he sinned. He fell from paradise and onto earth. The story says that he landed in India and he used this natural formation to cross the sea into Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, he stood on a mountaintop known as Adam's Peak for over 1,000 years as repentance for his sins. So both this mountain and this limestone bridge were named after him. Now, Adam's Bridge is also known as the Rama Setu to those of the Hindu faith. The Hindu story says that the god Rama had help from monkeys to build this bridge and cross into Sri Lanka. His wife Sita had been abducted by the demon king Ravana, so he had to go save her. She was in Sri Lanka and he was in India, so he built this bridge and he went to save her. Laos's Plain of Jars refers to an area in Laos in which over 2,100 stone jars were found that actually date back to the Iron Age. They're located in this plateau, and as I said, there's thousands of these jars, but they're not typical jars as you would think. They're actually big cylindrical rocks that are formed into jars, and they range in height from like 1 meter all the way up to 3 meters, so they're big. Some have stone lids, but it's widely agreed that most of these things had lids that were made from perishable materials like animal skins. Anyway, they were mostly constructed in the Iron Age from like 500 BC all the way up until 800 AD. So what exactly were they used for? Well, some people think they were used in burial rituals. Human bones, burial goods, and other ceramics have been found in and around the jars. There were also colored glass beads, teeth and bone fragments, and more actually inside the jars. Here's a rundown of the burial ritual that they probably followed. First, they placed the dead body inside the jar. As for what the body's doing while it's inside the jar, it's making a transition from its earthly plane to its heavenly plane. This was what they called distillation, and this distilled body was then cremated and buried, which would explain the urns and everything else found in this field. There's a lot of weird stuff going on here. Alright, so everything that's actually real is over now, but I want to tell you a local legend about these jars. The local Laotians say that there was once a race of giants that inhabited this field. Their king needed a place to brew and store tons and tons of rice wine, so he had these stone jars created, and once the giants left, they just left these jars sitting there. So it was probably a burial ritual, but you know, there's a chance of giants, which is pretty cool. So Polynesia's sweet potatoes is a theory based around the early introduction of sweet potatoes to the Polynesian culture. Alright, so why exactly should literally anybody care about early sweet potatoes in the Polynesian islands? Well, the fact that sweet potatoes, which originated in South America, can be dated back to 1000 AD on the Polynesian islands means that these Polynesian people probably had earlier contact with the South Americans than they were supposed to. This challenges the obvious narrative that the first connection that the Polynesian people had with South Americans was in 1492 with Christopher Columbus. On a side note, I'm glad this guy's not getting all the credit he used to, because he was like a massive jerk. If you actually read about what he did, he wasn't that guy. He was just terrible. Anyway, the Polynesian people have literally always been touted for their maritime navigation skills, so it's not insane to say that some of these people, which would probably have been the Rapa Nui people of Easter Island, might have traveled to South America and brought back sweet potatoes at an early time. Aside from just sweet potatoes, DNA evidence says that the South American people and Polynesian people have like crossovers before the time of Columbus, so that's important. So if this did happen, how exactly did the Polynesian people travel to South America? Well, they had fancy double-hulled build canoes that could hold up to 80 people that they could sail for months at a time in. They very well could have made this trip for whatever reason they were going for, and they brought sweet potatoes back with them. The lost city of Davaraka refers to a lost city from Hindu mythology that was supposedly founded by a god before it was submerged in the sea. Now this city was also known as Dwarka, which is what I'm gonna call it because Davaraka doesn't sound right. I'm probably not saying that right, so Dwarka is easier to pronounce. Anyway, this city is very similar to Atlantis in that it was submerged in the ocean and it was never found until marine archaeologists found remains of a city where it was said to be. Now it was supposed to be on the western tip of a strip of land in India that also borders the Arabian Sea like the rest of India. But anyway, that's where it was, and that's where the remains were found. All these underwater remains suggest that the city was actually submerged 7,500 years ago, which actually kind of lines up with the Hindu legend of Lord Krishna. This Lord Krishna is a major Hindu god, and it's said that he established this city, so it all kind of fits together. Dwarka was said to cover 84 square miles and be absolutely chock full of gold and ancient technology like the Vimanas that we talked about in the last episode. Obviously, this just gives more fuel to the fire that ancient Indians might have had contact with ancient aliens, so that's pretty cool. Also, on a side note, when I'm talking about aliens and giants, I'm kidding for the most part. So yeah. Alright, so how did this city get submerged? So according to legend, Krishna established Dwarka. A long time after he established it, he left the physical realm to go transcend into the heavens or whatever he did in Hinduism. And whenever he did that, the god of the ocean claimed the city as his own and submerged it in the ocean. If Dwarka was real and it actually sunk, it probably sunk because of earthquakes and tsunamis or just simply rising sea levels. It probably wasn't claimed by an ocean deity, but you never know. Dwarka remains a holy place in Hinduism today, so maybe one day they'll get to scuba dive down there and explore the city. The White Shaman mural is a 26-foot long collection of pictographs painted on the face of a rock shelter in the lower Pecos Canyonlands in Texas. It's actually just a mile upstream from where the Pecos River meets the Rio Grande, so it's actually way down there close to the Mexican border. This area is absolutely rich with Native American murals, monuments, just archaeological stuff that's awesome to look at and remember their culture, and this White Shaman mural is one of the most popular ones of all that. It was originally thought to be just a random collection of pictographs painted over time by different individuals, but a new theory says that it was actually a cohesive mural. Now you can't talk about this mural without talking about the archaeologist that came up with this new theory of the mural, Carolyn Boyd. She pieced all this together using her experience as an artist and a muralist before becoming an archaeologist just for this. Alright, so this mural has abstract depictions of humans, animals, the setting sun, a full moon, and an elongated headless human figure. This headless human figure probably represents a shaman, which was like a religious leader kind of in Native American cultures. The most common interpretation of this mural is that it represents the fever dreams that shamans of the time had because they ingested hallucinogenic plants. They were known to use hallucinogenics in their rituals and stuff, so this is what it's always thought to have been. But Dr. Boyd has a different line of thinking regarding this. She thinks that the mural represents documented instructions on how to perform what's known as a peyote ritual. Now guess what a peyote ritual is? It's using a hallucinogenic plant known as a peyote cactus to induce fever dreams, basically. It's supposed to have religious meanings and be very important to the people of the time, but like I said, these people were tripping. Literally. The tunnels at Baiae are a complex set of tunnels in Baiae, Italy that have very, very mysterious origins. Baiae is located in southern Italy and it overlooks the Bay of Naples, and it has hot springs. It has a lot of tourist attractions, so it was once used as like a vacation home for wealthy Roman citizens. Since then, most of the city has actually become submerged in the sea due to volcanic activity from like Mount Vesuvius and all the volcanoes around it. Alright, now that that's out of the way, an archaeological exploration of the city found a cave that's thought to be known as the Cave of the Sibyl. The Cave of the Sibyl is a cave that's talked about in ancient legends, and it's said to have housed the Sibyl, who was a prophetess who sat there forever in that cave. Literally, she lived forever, and she prophesied the future. She wrote prophecies that eventually became a priceless manual for avoiding impending disasters in ancient Rome. Alright, so beyond the Cave of the Sibyl lies the complex tunnel set that we were talking about. The tunnels are theorized to have been a symbolic version of the Greek underworld. It's said that to cross into the afterlife, Greek citizens citizens would have to cross the river Styx. These heated and steamy volcanic tunnels would have been a great representation of Hades after you crossed the river, or like the little stream that was in the first part of the tunnel complex. Obviously the stream represented the river Styx. Now nobody truly knows what these tunnels were used for, but it's very, very likely that they were used in some sort of Greek or Roman underworld ritual. They also don't even know who dug these things, so there's a lot of work that needs to be done on these tunnels. The Herto Man is a set of human remains found in Ethiopia that date back to over 160,000 years ago. Previously there was a gap in the fossil record from 300,000 years ago to 100,000 years ago, and this Herto Man remains, it's actually several people, but anyway, these remains fill that gap. Like I said, there were actually 3 skulls found, so it's not just the Herto Man, it's the Herto men, I guess. These skulls are in between the modern skulls that we have now and the skulls that were found 300,000 years ago, so they really do fit the gap pretty well. They also proved that humans were not Neanderthals. The Herto Man actually lived before Neanderthals, and his skull was distinctly not Neanderthal, so it's like he was an actual ancestor of us, not the Neanderthals. There's a lot of scientific theory about that. He was the true ancestor of modern humans. He was found with other bones, like I said, but he was also found with little tools, like he had hand axes that he definitely used to cut up animals and stuff. The hanging coffins of China are unique burial monuments created by the Bo people of ancient China. They were wooden coffins that were each carved out of a single solid block of wood that were then hung from the sides of cliffs once their inhabitants' remains were placed in them. Now I say hung because most often they were actually placed on support beams, like the beams were little wood planks that were shoved into the sides of the cliffs. I guess they had to chisel out holes for them, but anyway, that's how they sat on there. From my understanding, these people somehow either climbed the cliffs or they built like scaffolds to work off of, but anyway, they would chisel out holes of the sides of the cliffs, place these wood boards in there, and then they would either lower the coffin from the top or they would somehow get it up from the bottom, but I figure it's probably from the top. They would lower the coffin onto the support boards, and that's where it would sit. The purpose behind the hanging coffin seems to be to keep animals from defiling the bodies by digging them up, and also to keep the land free, because, you know, I guess buzzards and stuff can still get them whenever they're hanging on the sides of cliffs, but if they're in the ground, anything can dig them up, and you can't use that ground anymore. Cemeteries really are kind of a waste of space whenever you can just hang them, but, you know, that's just me. So the Bo people, they were a minority in China that was all but wiped out during the Ming Dynasty's conquering of China. Now, it's terribly sad, but these hanging coffins are pretty much all that's left of their culture and legacy. Within the coffins themselves were like human remains, obviously, but there were also copper jewelry, iron spears and tools. There were like wooden plaques, bowls, plates, stuff like that, stuff from their culture, even embroidered clothing. Now, it's terribly sad, but the Bo people created these wonders, and that's basically all that's left of them. They have these hanging coffins, they have these pieces of their culture, but I guess they did make their mark on the world if these things are still standing 500 years after the Bo people were wiped out. The land of Punt was a legendary country said to be rich in resources like gold and exotic goods that traded with ancient Egypt and maybe ancient Greece. Alright, so at the very least, the land of Punt was referenced as a trading partner to Egypt over 4,500 years ago, and it was mentioned multiple times in hieroglyphs over the years. It's said that the Egyptians would load up their ships and whatever, they would travel down the Nile and the Red Sea, and then they would go to the land of Punt. They would bring back exotic goods like gold, ebony, ivory, frankincense and myrrh, and just countless other things, even baboons. Now, these baboons were key to locating the general area in which the land of Punt was. Speculation about where it actually was has continued for thousands of years, but nobody is sure where it was because the hieroglyphs were so vague in their descriptions. It's considered to be in either the Horn of Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, or even Sri Lanka for some reason, but where was it actually? Well, mummified baboons in Egypt traced the location back to the entirety of the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa, because they lived in both of these areas. So that was no help at all. Ethiopia, Somalia, Yemen, Eritrea, and several other places are still possible locations of the land of Punt because, you know, we just don't know. The only insight we have to a precise location of the land of Punt is the proposed Greek equivalent Opon. It's theorized that Punt and Opon were the same place, and Opon was located in modern-day Somalia. Similar stories exist about gold and exotic goods coming from the land of Opon and Punt, so maybe, just maybe, They're the same place, and we have an answer to where the land of Punt was. The pyramids at Argolis are a group of pyramid-like structures that were created in ancient Greece that are kinda similar to the ancient pyramids of Egypt, but much, much smaller. The main structure studied is the pyramid at Helionikon, which is about 30 feet by 23 feet by 12 feet tall, which is way smaller than the Egyptian pyramids. The Great Pyramid of Giza is 756 feet wide and long by like 480 feet tall. Here's a visual representation that you can see the comparison of the size in. Anyway, the Greek pyramids are absolutely nothing like the Egyptian pyramids and probably served a completely different purpose. Theories say that they could have been used as burial places like the Egyptian pyramids, but it's more likely that they were used as agricultural facilities and or storm shelters. There's a complete lack of anything to suggest that they were used in burial rituals, like there's no graves, there's no nothing. They had interior rooms and they had a water supply, so that's why agriculture is probably thought of to be the closest. The other debate about these Greek pyramids as opposed to the Egyptian pyramids is which one was created first. For the Greek pyramids, there's conflicting dating methods that say that it was either created in like 2500 BC or 400 BC, which are totally different times in history, just completely different. Maybe one day we'll get this all straightened out, because as of right now it's a mess. We do not know when these things were created. The Ogdoad was a group of 8 primordial deities of ancient Egypt that were traditionally made up of 4 man-woman pairs. Nu and Nonet represent water, Heh and Hahet represent eternity, Kek and Koket represent darkness, and Amun and Amunet represent air, probably. That was a mouthful. I just read all of that because I can't even pronounce that. The problem with these gods is that sometimes they're not actually the same group of gods. Like sometimes a pair of these gods will be thrown out and a different pair will be thrown in there. It's actually kind of a mess, but in general they all represent the creation as it was seen in Egyptian mythology. They were first recorded in the old Egyptian kingdom in Hermopolis, so they actually existed before the new Egyptian gods like Osiris and Isis. They've almost been lost in transition, as you can pretty much tell, but there's actually a theory out there that I kind of want to mention. It says that the Ogdoad could actually be the Egyptian interpretation of Noah's family from the biblical flood. 8 husband and wife pairs could be Noah and his 3 sons and their wives. Nu and Nonet represent water, which could possibly be Noah and his wife. Now I'm not going to explain why, because there's a lot of linguistic relationships going on there that you just have to read an article and find out about. I'm not going to dive too deep into that, but there's also similarities between the 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and these other gods, so it's worth looking into. It's pretty cool. What are ley lines? A generic definition of ley lines is that they're hypothetical straight lines that crisscross their way across Earth and connect sacred monuments and have Earth energies. Like what? Basically, they're imaginary lines that conspiracy theorists say connect ancient monuments like Stonehenge, the Great Pyramids, Machu Picchu, and even local things like churches and burial mounds, cemeteries, stuff like that. It's generally thought to be pseudoscience, but some people think that our ancient ancestors actually believed in these things and they built monuments and stuff based on their proximity to the ley lines. These people think that ley lines contain energies of the earth and they can actually be sensed by dowsing. If you don't know, dowsing uses rods that move whenever they sense minerals or water or apparently ley lines. The thing is, dowsing for things like water actually seems to work, but most people think it's still a pseudoscience. It probably is, but it seems to work. Anyway, let's get to my favorite ley line theory. One guy thinks that Earth's ley lines serve as runways for alien spaceships, and I see no reason for that not to be true. Who were the Guanches? The Guanches were the indigenous people of the Canary Islands off of Morocco. It's basically been proven that before they landed in the Canary Islands, they were members of the Berber people of North Africa, because number 1, their languages have a lot of similarities, and number 2, they have genetic similarities. Now, the Guanches were very tall people that were virtually indistinguishable from the Spanish people other than that height. They were cattle and goat farmers, they were hunter-gatherers, and they were tribalistic in nature. It's important to note that once upon a time, all the Aboriginal people of the different Canary Islands had different names for each people. Guanches actually means people of Tenerife, which is one of the Canary Islands where the Guanches people originated, but then the name Guanches grew to encompass all of the inhabitants of the Canary Islands. They were visited by the Romans, Carthaginians, Phoenicians, and the Spanish, but eventually the Spanish people conquered them because that's just what Spanish did back in the day. They had their own language, religion, and customs, but all that basically disappeared after the conquest by the Spanish. The Sajama lines are a network of thousands of straight lines carved into the ground in Bolivia that cover a whopping 8,697 square miles. Here's a map of them. They make a web-like pattern that makes absolutely no sense when you're actually viewing it. They were carved into the earth by literally scraping aside vegetation sedimentation and the layer of topsoil over a period of 3,000 years. The people living near the Sajama volcano in the Andes Mountains did this. They were pre-Columbian, pre-Incan indigenous people, probably the Aymara people actually. Their lines were considered the largest artwork in the world, but what were they there for? Well, I don't know. They probably had some sort of religious or astronomical significance to the people, but we really don't know for sure. Some people believe that the Aymara people walked in straight lines for miles as their pilgrimages in their ancient religion, so that could have been what they were for. Or, you know, aliens. The Iron Pillar of Delhi is a nearly 24-foot tall iron pillar with a 16-inch diameter that stands in Delhi, India. It was originally constructed near the turn of the 4th century AD, and the special thing about this thing is that after all these years, it's basically rust-free. The ancient ironworkers of India used a perfect composition of an outer layer that never rusted, and it's worked so well to this day. It's crazy. It's like nearly 2,000 years and no rust. Now, despite weighing 6 tons, this pillar was actually moved from its original location, which was debated as to where it actually was, to its current location in Delhi. There's Sanskrit inscriptions in the pillar that say that it was originally created for the use in a temple that served the god Vishnu. There's also a legend that says that if you place your back around the pillar and you reach around it, making sure your fingers touch, like this, that you'll have a wish granted, like anything you wish will come true. So if you're ever in Delhi, you should jump the fence around the pillar and try that out, but you better make your wish to get out of jail. The Paracas candelabra is a massive geoglyph carved into the soil in the Paracas Peninsula in Peru that represents a giant candelabra. It's very similar to and definitely connected to the Nazca lines. Now, like I said, this thing is cut 2 feet deep into the sand soil there, and it's like 560 feet tall by 200 feet wide, which is enough to see it 12 miles away at sea. It dates back to about 200 BC, which is very much in the time frame of the Nazca Line's creation, so it's definitely connected. Now, obviously, this thing probably wasn't created to represent a candelabra. It's more likely that it was created to represent the trident of the creator god of the Paracan people. Either that or the Jimson weed. This weed had hallucinogenic effects and probably was used in the rituals of those people. Now, I personally like the trident theory better because a trident dedicated to the creator god of the people makes a lot more sense to me than a random weed, but you do you. Let me know what you think. The Great Serpent Mound is a 1,350 foot long by 3 foot high mound that snakes its way across a plateau in Peebles, Ohio. It's what's known as an effigy mound because it forms a serpent figure. Like whenever you look at it from afar, it looks like a big snake in the hillside. It was created by the Native American people of the area, probably the Fort Ancient culture, although there's a couple others that it could have been. The Fort Ancient culture was a group of Native Americans that lived in Ohio and the surrounding areas. They famously farmed maize or corn, and they thrived until the Spanish explorers came in and brought disease that wiped out their whole civilization, basically. This is starting to be a theme of this channel. The Spanish were like the villains. Anyway, like most Native American peoples, these people granted like supernatural abilities and stuff like that to snakes and serpents, so they probably thought highly enough of snakes to create this massive mound. The mound itself has 7 coils, it has a triple coiled tail, and an open mouthed serpent head. In front of the open serpent mouth is an oval shaped mound that probably represents like an egg or the body of a frog that the serpent's eating, but some people think it represents the sun for some reason. Yet again, back to that supernatural stuff. Because of the burial mounds scattered around the Great Serpent Mound, a lot of people think that this whole mound was used to guide spirits to the afterlife or something like that. But there's a noted absence of like grave goods, burial goods, stuff like that, so maybe not. We really don't know. It also could have been used to track time. The serpent's head aligns with the summer solstice, and the tail points directly at the sunrise of the winter solstice. Yet again, these ancient cultures surprise me with their knowledge of like time and astronomy and stuff like that. They're just really cool. The screaming mummy can refer to several different mummies discovered over time, but I'm primarily going to talk about the one known as Unknown Man E. This is a mummy that was found in 1881 with his mouth open in what looks like a just heart-wrenching scream. He was found in a cavern in Egypt at the end of a 45-foot vertical shaft with over 40 other mummies, including the mummies of several pharaohs. Theorists say that tomb robbing was very prevalent at one point in Egypt, so Egyptian priests likely gathered up all the bodies of what looked like important mummies and they tossed them in this vertical shaft so nobody messed with their bodies and their afterlife spiritual journeys, stuff like that. that. And like I said, this is a very, very random cave, so nobody's gonna look there. Alright, so to understand the significance behind a few things, you're gonna have to learn a little bit about the mummification ritual in Egypt. With your body, your name was written on a wooden tag that was placed around your neck. Without this name tag, the body was just a body. It had no source of identification, so it couldn't transcend into the afterlife. While all the other bodies that were found in this same cave had a name tag around them, Unknown Man E had no such thing, so he would probably be cursed to their version of hell. Several theories were crafted about who he was, but none of them would actually explain why he was like dishonored, not given a name tag, stuff like that, except for the one that I'm gonna mention. This theory takes us back all the way to the days of Rameses III, who was the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom in Egypt. One of Rameses' wives, Taye, wanted her son Pentower to succeed Rameses III as the next great pharaoh instead of the chosen Rameses IV. She conspired with court officials to get Rameses III executed, and she actually succeeded in this, but Pentower never seized the throne. Rameses IV had the conspirators tried and executed, but Pentower wasn't quite that lucky. After he was convicted, he was forced to end his own life in that courtroom, or whatever their equivalent to a courtroom was. He either died screaming or his face was contorted to look like that whenever they mummified him. It was all but confirmed that Pentower was the Unknown Man E, or the Screaming Mummy. What happened to the Anasazi? First off, the Anasazi people were a group of ancestors of the modern day Pueblo people. They lived near the Four Corners area of Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona from the years like 200 AD to 1300 AD. Now, Anasazi actually translates to ancient enemies in Navajo language, which the Pueblo people don't care for, so now they're known as the ancestral Puebloans. Around the year 1300 AD, the ancestral Puebloans up and left their civilization. They migrated toward the Rio Grande and the Little Colorado rivers, but here's the thing, nobody really knows why they did this. While some people originally thought that it was like a single cataclysmic event that led to their downfall, it's more likely that it was like a perfect storm of stuff that happened, kind of like the late Bronze Age collapse. It just hit their civilization all at once. Environmental factors like severe drought and lack of resources probably led to a lot of this. No water means that food barely grows, and what food does grow is going to be fought over because there's not much. These factors alone are enough to constitute a move, but there's an even darker theory out there. It says that cannibalism was implemented by the tribe leaders, and the normal people of the tribe were just mortified by this. They were getting killed and literally eaten, so they got out. Regardless if the cannibalism theory is true or not, resource depletion and lack of food always leads to social unrest. It's going to lead to conflict and wars, and that's just not good. In my opinion, the ancestral Puebloans just needed a change in their society. They needed to change where they were so they could thrive, and it worked. The Kabiri were secret gods worshipped by the Greeks in secret cults and societies. It's said that they were originally Phrygian or Thracian gods that were brought into the Greek pantheon after the explosion of Hellenism. The Kabiri are typically portrayed as two males, Axiocersus and his son Cadmilus, and two females, Axierus and Axiocersa. They were considered chthonic or underworld deities that had a lot to do with fertility, and they were also the protectors of seafarers. Now, different cults had different meanings associated with the group. In Lemnos, which was an island that was Hellenized, the Kabiri were worshipped by like a mystery cult, but the members of the Kabiri were a totally different group of gods. Like they had different names and different personalities, different meanings, stuff like that. There was another interpretation of the group in Samothrace. In general, the Kabiri were thought of as like attendants and associated with the god Hephaestus, so there's some trivia you might not have known. Let's kick it off with Adam's calendar. This is a megalithic stone circle about 100 feet in diameter located in Mpumalanga, South Africa. It's also called the African Stonehenge because, like the OG Stonehenge, it's a megalithic stone structure created by prehistoric people for like celestial purposes, probably. Alright, so the local South African people thought that this thing was probably created around 500 years ago, but that's not the current theory. Archaeologists are now saying that it could date all the way back to 75,000 years ago, maybe even up to 200,000 years ago, which is just so long ago it's incomprehensible. If it happens to be this old, it's probably the first man-made structure like this. It was created to be like the first calendar by these people. Its stones roughly align with solstices. The stones are also arranged in kind of a Orion constellation formation, and so on and so forth. Because of its connection to ancient astronomy, it gets its two nicknames. First, Adam's calendar, because obviously the first man-made structure was made by the first man, according to the Bible anyway, and second, the birthplace of the sun because of its connection to the celestial body. Alright, so in general, there's no definitive evidence that suggests that this thing was created by men millennia ago, but there's also no proof that it wasn't, so it's really fun to speculate. The Baigong pipes are a series of pipe-like structures found in and on White Mountain near the city of Dalinga, China. Upon first look, they seem to be really similar to the pipes that we use today to transport water and gas and stuff like that, but if you look again, they're definitely not recently man-made, at least. Some of these pipes lead to the shore and even the center of a lake, so you can assume they might be water pipes, but they don't exactly function like that. The pipes were analyzed and found to be 92% natural in their composition, but 8% was unidentifiable. You know what that could mean, right? Aliens. Well, that's probably not true. It's probably more like a naturally oxidized structure that just seems to look like pipes. Something like, you know, fossilized tree roots that were hollow in the center that make it look like pipes. It was more than likely something natural like this and wasn't actually used as pipes, but you know, it's pretty cool to think about. Some people, especially from the Dalinga area of China, believe that there was an ancient civilization out there and they probably used these pipes tens of thousands of years ago to transport water for irrigation or whatever, so you never know. Human-made ditches in the Amazon rainforest are just as the name implies. They're human-made ditches and geoglyphs that are carved into the ground in the land that's now the Amazon rainforest. These ditches are actually pretty prevalent, with some being up to 36 feet wide and 13 feet deep. That's a massive ditch. The thing is, most of these ditches weren't actually found until the 1980s, whenever they started clearing some of the Amazon rainforest for use in cattle farms. These things are thought to be quite literally thousands of years old, existing even before the Amazon rainforest was a thing. But here's the thing, we have no inkling at all as to why they were created. Theories say that they could have been used for drainage, defensive purposes, religious purposes, or even a prehistoric version of a supermarket where everybody got together and bought and sold their goods. There were actually some pots that were probably used for agricultural purposes found at one of the scenes, so that's where that theory comes from. The moral of the story is we simply don't know what these ditches were made for. If you're unaware, this is actually tier 6 of the Ancient Mysteries Iceberg series that we've been covering, so that's why all of these things are like unexplainable. They're very obscure. The Rajum El Hiri is a megalithic stone structure of concentric circles with a burial mound in the center. It's located about 10 miles off the coast of the Sea of Galilee in Syria, and it dates back to around 3000 BC. Like so many of the other stone structures we've already talked about, it's linked back to Stonehenge and referred to as Stonehenge of the East. This thing is made up of over 40,000 rocks, which makes sense as to why the outer circle in the series of concentric circles is 520 feet in diameter. That's basically a football field and a half, including the end zones, so that's just crazy. The burial mound that's in the center rises about 15 feet high, and here's a fun fact about that. It wasn't created until about 1,000 years after the series of concentric circles was. Alright, so what exactly was this place built for and who built it? Well, we don't have exact answers for either one of these questions, but we can assume one of two things about the creators. Number one, it was built by the early Bronze Age nomadic people of the Middle East, because that's just a layup. That's probably who it had to have been, unless number two is true. Number two is that it could have been giants. Giants known as Rephaim in the Bible could have built this structure, and out of all the crazy conspiracy theories I've talked about on this channel, this is one that could be the most true. There is over 40,000 tons worth of rocks that make up this structure, and archaeologists predict that it would have taken humans of the time about 25,000 working days to complete. That is 68 years. Most human projects are abandoned after like 3. Like, you know how quick people turn around these days. You know what would have sped up this process? Giants. Alright, so either way, this structure was built for something. Researchers believe that it could have just served as a tomb for somebody that's really important, which it definitely did serve as that at one point in time. That wasn't when it was created though. That was 1,000 years after, whenever they created the burial mound. It could have served as some sort of astronomical indicator. Its formations do match up with solstices and stuff like that, so it very well could be that. There's no concrete answer as to what it was used for, but it was probably something to do with the stars. The structure under the Sea of Galilee is a massive cone-shaped conglomeration of 60,000 tons worth of rocks that was found underwater in the Sea of Galilee. It has a massive diameter of 230 feet and it rises 32 feet high. This is basically twice the size of, guess what? Stonehenge, so that gives you an idea. The whole thing appears to be a massive rock cairn, or you know, a structure that was made by humans piling rocks on top of one another over and over and over again. The structure was actually accidentally found by a group of researchers using sonar to just scan under the water. While this location could suggest that men created the structure under the water for use as something like a fish nursery, it's far more likely that it was created on land and it eventually was just swallowed up by rising sea levels. Also, because of its location, it's very, very hard to do any kind of substantial study on it. It's under the sea. Rough estimates date its creation to anywhere from 2,000 years ago to 12,000 years ago, so we really just don't know. The Tophet at Carthage is a sacred place dedicated to the worship of the Phoenician gods Tanit and Baal that was involved in some very questionable activities. The activities in question are primarily child sacrifices. The Tophet served as both a sanctuary to perform these sacrifice rituals and a necropolis for the children that were affected, like all their tombs were there. As I said, this ritual dates back to the ancient Canaanite religion, then the Phoenician religion, then the Carthaginian religion. It was all just like a linear delineation of the religion. Child sacrifices were supposedly dedicated to the god Moloch in the Bible, but scholars today say that Moloch was more of a term that referred to the practice of sacrificing children itself. It wasn't an actual god, it was just the ritual. Within the site are tons of stellae, which are wooden slabs that serve as like memorials on the tombs, as well as urns and religious stuff like grave goods, all that kind of stuff. These urns obviously suggest that the biblical stories of child sacrifices involving the burning of their bodies was true, because, you know, I don't know if they were dead or alive, but their bodies were burned and put in these urns. There were over 20,000 urns found within the Tophet. If that many children were sacrificed, I really don't even know what to say. Let's just move on, because this is getting depressing. Why did the Kukutini Tripilia culture burn down their houses? Well, to start with, we got to figure out who these people were. These were the early people of southeastern Europe that existed between the years of like 5050 BC and 2950 BC, and they were mostly in the areas of like Moldova, Romania, and Ukraine. They had advanced pottery, agriculture, and eventually metallurgy. For some reason, these people seem to have purposefully burned down their homes every 60 to 80 years and then rebuilt them in the same spots. Now, most of their population centers were created around naturally fortified locations like canyon edges and river terraces, so it's thought that the burning down of these homes could have been to like reallocate the space that's in that limited area of fortification. Just one of these wooden structures was estimated to be about 7,500 square feet, so space allocation definitely could have been, you know, why they did this. Another theory as to why this happened is that these houses were actually looked at as part of the family. As the older family members died out, these structures were burned down with them in remembrance of them and then rebuilt by the newer generations. It could have been some kind of family or tribal ritual, because these were definitely controlled burns. Like, we know that they set these things on fire super hot, but they controlled the burns. So, you know, there's not enough concrete evidence to say either way as to why they were burned down, but it was on purpose. Atlantis of the Sands refers to the lost city of Ubar that was supposedly found in the southern deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. Now, for some background, Ubar was thought to have been destroyed by a natural disaster or the wrath of a god, which are not mutually exclusive, I realize that now. It's actually linked to the legendary city of Iram from the Quran. Now, this city of Iram from the Quran is known as Iram of the Pillars, and it was destroyed by the Islamic god for their wickedness, kind of like Sodom and Gomorrah were. Fast forward to 1992, and archaeologists have found a lost city in the area of Oman in the Arabian Peninsula. This was deemed to be the lost city of Ubar, which was like a rich city, kind of like Atlantis was. Obviously, its similarities in the fact that it was lost and it was rich and all that give it the nickname Atlantis of the Seas. So to tie it all together, the remains that were found in 1992 may or may not actually be the city of Ubar, and if it is, then legends probably greatly overstate like the riches and marvels of this land. It seemed to be more of a trading post than like a thriving ancient city. Now, as I tried to explain earlier, theorists say that this land of Ubar was probably the land of Iram from the Quran, but there's not any substantial evidence to any of this stuff, so I'm just going to cut my losses on this one and move on. Cannabis burial shroud in China refers to a burial shroud made up of 13 cannabis plants that was found in a grave in Jiayi Cemetery in China. It dates back to around 400 BC, so it was probably created by the Subeshi people of the time of the area. The man that was buried was around 35 years old with Caucasian features, so it's likely that he was a traveler along the Silk Road that just didn't make it. Similar burials using cannabis have been found in the same area, including a woman that was found along the Silk Road that had breast cancer that was buried with like cannabis seeds, so this could be something similar. He could have suffered from something like cancer. Now, these 13 plants that were used in the shroud were fresh and probably green whenever they were used as the burial shroud, so they were probably grown in this area. The nomadic tribes of the Silk Road often used drugs and cannabis plants and stuff like that in their rituals, so there was probably no shortage of this kind of stuff around here. Now, this man that was buried seemed to have been some kind of like shaman or religious leader of his warrior warrior-like people because of the grave goods and the cannabis burial shroud. That's what they all suggest. I guess he was buried with a cannabis shroud because of the as in life, so in death philosophy. Liquid mercury at Teotihuacan refers to pools of liquid mercury that were found underneath the Temple of the Feathered Serpent in Mexico. Teotihuacan is an ancient city and culture that predates even the Aztecs, thought to have been established in like 100 BC. This Temple of the Feathered Serpent is just one of the marvels that these people created, along with the pyramids of the sun and the moon. Anyway, despite this structure sitting there for about 2,000 years, nobody knew that there was an underground chamber underneath the temple until 2003. It wasn't even explored until 2015 because that's how fast archaeologists work. I know there's a lot of red tape cutting and all that kind of stuff, but I really wish people would just get a move on with exploring some of these things. But anyway, along with thousands of artifacts that were found that tell us things about this culture, there were also these small pools of mercury found in this chamber. Archaeologists think it probably was once a flowing river of mercury that was meant to resemble like the river Styx, you know, kind of from Greek mythology, like a gate to the underworld, something like that. Now my mind immediately goes to the tomb of Qin Shi Huang that's said to have flowing rivers of mercury very similar to this. Some think that this liquid mercury river indicates that there could be like a royal tomb somewhere nearby, but they haven't found one yet, to my knowledge anyway. St. Thomas silver coins in India refers to ancient coins thought to be linked to St. Thomas, who was an apostle of Jesus, who was said to have come to India to spread Christianity. According to the apocryphal text, the Acts of Thomas, he supposedly traveled to India, started some churches, and was then executed in India. In the areas where he started churches, these ancient coins have been popping up left and right. Since like the 19th and 20th centuries, these coins are popping up and they seem to depict St. Thomas. They're typically bronze coins, but they do have some traces of silver. There's a whole theory about these coins being the ones that Judas got whenever he betrayed Jesus, but I'm not going to go into that part. Now, these coins do depict Christian imagery such as crosses, fish, and even depictions of St. Thomas himself, so, you know, it could be real. Now, I will say it's highly debated as to whether these things were created all the way back in the 1st century or if they were later minted by like the Roman or Byzantine Empire or something like that. There's no guarantee that these coins show the direct involvement of Thomas in India, but it seems pretty likely to me. The Griffin Warrior tomb is a tomb that was found in Pylos, Greece that dates all the way back to 1450 BC, which would have been in the height of the Mycenaean Greek culture. The grave itself was found in a stone shaft that contained a wooden coffin, over 3,500 Greek artifacts, and the body of a man who died around the age of 30 to 35 years old. He seemed to have been very rich due to the sheer amount of artifacts that were found, but he also could have been like a leader or somebody really important. He had tons of gold, ivory, and bronze artifacts that were found with him, but he also had something that connected him to a totally different culture, and that was a Minoan seal stone. This seal stone, along with many of these other artifacts upon further inspection, suggests that this man was deeply involved with the Minoans on Crete. All that is despite the fact that he was actually a Mycenaean Greek. Now, prior to this discovery, the Mycenaean Greeks and the Minoans on Crete were thought to have stayed in their own lanes for the most part. There weren't many crossover episodes unless they were just fighting. It's thought that this Griffin warrior, who actually gets his name from an ivory plaque that featured a griffin on it, was actually an administrator or somebody that ruled over the Minoans for the Mycenaeans. Either that or he just did a lot of trading with them or something like that. He was important to both cultures. Because of this great wealth of artifacts and the clear connection to Crete before it was absorbed by Greece, the finding of this tomb was very important to Greek historians. Where is Jesus's foreskin? I can tell we're in the depths of the iceberg now. Jesus' foreskin, also known as the Holy Prepuce, is exactly what you think it is. According to Luke chapter 2 verse 21, Jesus was circumcised at 8 days of age like every other Jewish boy of the time. Since then, a bunch of weird people have developed a fascination for this cut off skin for some reason. I guess since Jesus' actual body was said to have gone back to heaven, people think that this little bit of skin that was cut off is like all that's left of his body on the earth, which I guess I can understand, but that's just weird. Anyway, many different European churches have claimed to have had this over the years. Somebody claims that it's currently located in the local parish church of Calcutta, India, also known as the Church of the Holy Name, but I don't know. I'm moving on. I feel sacrilegious even talking about this. Apollonius of Tyana was a Greek philosopher and supposed miracle worker from Tyana, which is in modern-day Turkey. He supposedly lived from the year 3 BC to 97 AD, and he was a follower of Pythagoras. He supposedly took a Pythagorean vow of silence, which is when you don't say anything for 5 years. which is crazy because I'd just be yapping all the time. I don't think I could do it. After all that learning under Pythagoras, he started his travels. He supposedly traveled to India to seek wisdom from Hindu sages and also study at the city of Taxila, which was like the city that was the learning hub of the entire area. Like that's where all the smart people gathered. Kind of like Alexandria. Speaking of Alexandria, he was said to have traveled there to learn from priests of all different faiths and backgrounds. Now we can get to his miracles. Just like Jesus, this guy was said to have performed lots of miracles. This includes healing the sick, exorcising demons, raising the dead, and even teleporting? Now, I've heard of all the first ones with Jesus and the apostles, but teleporting? I mean, what are you, Isotope from Invincible? As you can imagine, all this kind of stuff led to comparisons between him and Jesus all the time. Just like Jesus, he was definitely a real historical figure, but this guy most definitely wasn't a miracle worker. Regardless of your beliefs, you got to admit that the entire New Testament of the Bible is a better and more likely to be accurate source of information than like the pseudo-biography that Philostratus wrote for this guy. He didn't even write it till 100 years after this guy was supposedly dead, so I don't believe it. He was just a historical figure in my mind. Asherah was a great mother goddess from the ancient Semitic religions of the Near East. She was deeply associated with fertility and creation, and she has actually gone by many different names. She was known as the consort of many ancient gods, including Yahweh, before the ancient Israelites converted to like monotheism under Yahweh. So yes, she might have been the wife of God, which is crazy. There are tons of references to her in ancient religions, and in general, she's thought to be the equal partner in creation of the male god that was her counterpart. There's also actually been a link between Asherah and the biblical Eve that's being studied right now. In the Near East, Asherah is represented by what's known as Asherah poles. These are sacred trees dedicated to her worship, and during the entirety of the Old Testament, God constantly has to get his priests and prophets to destroy these things. Now, if you remember, Eve ate the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and it led to her eventual downfall and exile from the Garden of Eden, all that kind of stuff. Just as Asherah was outlawed by God, so was Eve cast out of the Garden of Eden. They both had their downfall, and it was both linked to a pole or a sacred tree. The ancient Israelites had some weird ideas, and I think they kind of conflated these two characters in their minds somehow, but let me know what you think about this down below. It's really interesting. The cromlech at Almendrez is a megalithic stone structure in a circular pattern located in Portugal that dates back to around 6000 BC. Like basically everything else, this predates Stonehenge, and it's comprised of 95 granite monument stones arranged in various patterns. Now, it's built to face the sunrise and the sunset, but its purpose is even more vague than the ones we've already talked about. It's believed that these stones served either religious purposes or as some sort of astronomical observatory. It was actually constructed in several phases. First, the concentric circles, and then the concentric ellipses. Oh yeah, we can't forget about the nickname of this place. I'll give you a second to guess it. It's not hard. Portuguese Stonehenge. Alright, so I understand that Stonehenge is awesome and everything, but not everything has to be named the blank Stonehenge. Like, there's like 12 that we've covered in this entire series. All of these Stonehenges are it's not Stonehenge. There's one Stonehenge. Everything else is its own monument. I'm so tired of it. People need to get a different naming system. Nitocris is a legendary character written about by Herodotus who may or may not have served as the last ruler of the Old Kingdom of Egypt. This story takes place in around 2100 BC, and she's said to have come into power after the Egyptian people murdered her brother who was the ruler. To avenge her brother, it's said that she gathered everyone that was instrumental in killing him into like a celebratory feast, but this was all a facade. Once she got everyone in the room and they were enjoying their feast or whatever, she flooded the room with a trapdoor that had the river Nile, like all the water from it just flooded the room and killed them all. She shut it off. It was like a closed chamber. They all drowned. After this, she didn't want to face the repercussions of her actions, so she actually just offed herself. What followed this was the beginning of the first intermediate period of Egypt. Now, all of this should be taken with a grain of salt because these were all Greek writings that talked about her. Like, there's no Egyptian records basically anywhere that says that she was even real. So, you know, take it with a grain of salt. No tomb was found, no inscriptions, no hieroglyphs, nothing. So, she's also been linked to the construction of the third pyramid at Giza, but yet again, there's literally no evidence as to where this comes from. It was just written about by some Hellenistic priest guy. This is a mystery that's probably more myth than reality, but it's still a really good story. The Lost Roman Legion in Liquan is a story that says that a Roman legion that fought in the Battle of Carrhae in Turkey was taken prisoner following the Roman loss, and they eventually became mercenaries and settled down in Asia. The supposed evidence for this theory is a written testimony of Chinese soldiers that fought in a battle that says that the people they fought against were in like a fish scale formation, which is also known as the Roman testudo formation of like a Roman phalanx. It's when they interlock their shields. Anyway, legend has it that this Roman legion settled down in the city of Liquan near the Silk Road in China. The inhabitants of this town to this day believe that they descend from this Roman legion. They even seemingly have European facial features, light eyes, light hair, and stuff like that. Obviously, that's totally different from the general population of China, but whenever you think about it, this place right here is pretty close to like the Siberian area, so it could have been, you know, Eastern Europeans. Who knows? Thing is, this story and the features of these people were enough to bring in a set of genetic researchers to actually test these people and see if they descended from a Roman legion. 87 villagers were tested, but only 3 of them had clear links to European genetics, with the rest of them being totally like inconclusive. None of them had any clearly Roman DNA in them, just European. So while that's not too promising, it doesn't rule it out either. Archaeological digs around the city have found buried walls and defensive formations, stuff like that, that actually do resemble like Roman formations, as well as some like Romanesque pottery. Overall, there's not enough evidence to say yay or nay, but I'd really like to think that this Roman legion did settle down here because that's just really cool. The Siberian Ice Maiden is a mummy from around 2500 years ago that was found in a tomb in the Altai Mountains in Siberia. Unlike most others in the area, her tomb was unlooted and her body was undefiled, so they both tell us a lot about her culture. She was only in her mid-20s, but she was clearly high-ranking in her society. She had super detailed tattoos of like deer, griffin-like creatures, and other beast-like figures. She also had super fancy clothing for the time, like a silk blouse, a crimson wool skirt, and thigh-high felt boots. The maiden was also buried with some of the craziest grave goods you will literally ever hear about, starting with 6 fully bridled and saddled horses. These horses had been executed like they had head wounds from a pickaxe or something like that to put them down, so you know that they thought a lot of this woman. They literally killed 6 of the most useful animals in history and buried them with this woman. That's crazy. They thought she might need them in the afterlife for some reason. I don't know about you, but I can only ride 1 horse at a time, so I don't know why she would ever need 6, but that's up to them, I guess. Anyway, she was also buried in a very intricately carved and painted wooden coffin, which definitely signifies that she was very high up in the Siberian Pazyryk culture of the time. Inside her tomb were cannabis seeds and psychoactive herbs that were probably used in rituals of the time. Finally, some luxurious Chinese silk was found inside, and that stuff was not cheap at all. Obviously, this woman was basically revered, but what ended up killing her? Well, if you remember earlier in the video, I mentioned a woman along the Silk Road that died with breast cancer. This woman was the Siberian Ice Maiden. Now, whether or not it actually killed her, we don't know, because she also had some wounds that were probably from a fall or accident or something like that. But we do know for a fact that she did have breast cancer, so that could have been it. The Yonaguni Monument is a massive underwater rock formation off the coast of Yonaguni, Japan, that actually has a massive controversy associated with it. Alright, I'll tell you the controversy part in a second, but first you gotta see this thing. It's super clean cut, and it looks like it was man-made into the form of like a step pyramid or a ziggurat or something like that. Now that's where the controversy lies, actually. Lots of people believe that it's the remains of an old city or at least a man-made structure, but some people think that it's a natural formation. This thing stretches out to be 165 feet long by 65 feet wide, so it's huge. It has that pyramid-like structure I was talking about. It has walls, passageways, platforms. It even has a central platform that people thought was a throne. Now on the other side of the argument, people have studied the Yonaguni Island itself and found formations that were clearly naturally formed that were very similar to this thing in the water. The chances of it actually being man-made are very slim, but it would have been cool. So basically what I'm saying is Japanese Atlantis is probably not real, but I definitely could get behind some, you know, mermaid waifus, you know what I'm saying? That has been the entire Ancient Mysteries iceberg. This has been a multiple month project for me, and it's let me know that I might can actually do this stuff on the regular. Thank you for sticking around to the end, and if you're still here, you might as well watch the next video right here. Until next time, peace.